Welcome, friend. I'm glad you're here tonight. The world outside is slowing down, and so are we. The night hums softly, perfect for stories that travel far beyond the clock. Settle in, breathe. Let your thoughts find room to wander. Wherever you're listening from, this moment is ours, a quiet doorway into history's hush. Tonight's story will take us through forgotten empires, fading stars, and the echoes left behind. If you enjoy drifting through the past like this, unhurried, curious at peace, subscribe and keep a place by the fire for next time. There's always another story waiting in the dark. He built an empire that shaded half the world, and centuries later, his blood still flows through millions of veins. How did one man change both history and biology? Tonight, we trace the invisible empire of Genghis Khan, not carved in stone, but written in DNA. The story begins not with horses galloping across the steppe, but with a quiet hum of machines inside a modern laboratory. Beakers, centrifuges, and computer screens glow under sterile light, while scientists trace human ancestry one molecule at a time. In 2003, a team of geneticists comparing Y chromosomes across Eurasia stumbled upon a pattern so bizarre it rewrote history. They had sampled more than 40 populations, from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, and found that roughly 8% of all men in that vast region carried the same genetic signature, a sequence of markers almost identical, generation after generation, stretching back to a single male who lived 8 centuries ago. Their statistical models converted those percentages into a human scale. About 16 million living men descended from one man whose identity was impossible to prove, but whose legend already echoed through every textbook and myth across Asia. Genghis Khan. The lab notes looked almost unreal. One Y chromosome lineage dominating territory that once matched the limits of the Mongol Empire. Science had found the ghost in our blood. It was as if the genes themselves remembered the sound of hooves. Imagine the opening montage. A technician carefully pipettes DNA while wind sweeps through endless grasslands. Microscopic close-ups of chromosomes intercut with aerial sweeps of Mongolia's rolling plains. The same wind that once carried the banners of Genghis Khan now rattles solar panels and satellite dishes on research stations. The narrator's voice slows as we grasp the paradox. How could the legacy of a single man persist invisibly across continents, long after his cities, armies, and empire had turned to dust? This is not merely a tale of conquest. It is a story of biology meeting history, where violence and fertility collided to create an empire that still breathes through living descendants. The geneticists called it a star cluster haplotype, a branch on the Y chromosome, family tree that seemed to burst outward from Mongolia like rays of sunlight. Unlike other genetic markers that show gradual diffusion, this one spread explosively, an unmistakable signature of rapid male-driven expansion. When the data were mapped, the shape almost resembled the roots of Mongol invasions. For scientists accustomed to slow patterns of migration, this looked like a lightning strike. The finding raised more questions than answers. How did such a lineage multiply so quickly? Who was its founder? And what combination of power, violence, and opportunity could allow one man's DNA to outcompete millions of others? To understand that, we have to return to a world before maps and nations, when identity was measured by blood and cattle, and when survival depended on how many people carried your name and your genes. The Central Asian steppe was less a country than an ocean of grass divided by clans and tribes that lived and died by their horses. In this landscape, lineage was currency. And every alliance, every raid, every marriage reshaped the unseen network of kinship. Into this volatile ecology was born Temujin, a boy who would become Genghis Khan. Poverty and exile made him ruthless, but also taught him the math of survival. Men could be killed by the sword, but their legacy could multiply through offspring. The idea was as old as humanity itself, but on those wild plains it became strategy. Across tribal societies, dominance often meant reproduction. Victorious chiefs claimed wives and concubines as trophies of power. In war, subjugated families became part of the victor's household, their bloodlines absorbed into the conquerors. For centuries, this cycle of violence and assimilation had slowly shaped the genetics of the region. But Genghis Khan's rise changed the scale completely. When he united the Mongol clans in the early 13th century and forged an empire from Korea to the Caspian Sea, he didn't just rewrite political borders, he reprogrammed the human genome of Asia. His sons and grandsons, ruling over vast territories, inherited not only his empire but his extraordinary opportunity to reproduce. Every city conquered meant more captives, more marriages, more births tied to the name of the great Khan. Yet the story isn't simply a biological triumph. Behind those numbers lie human costs, conquest, slavery, coercion, and the systemic taking of women as spoils of war. The gene that now links millions of men to a single ancestor also reminds us of the violence embedded in inheritance. Each data point represents countless lives folded into the genealogy of empire. Fertility does not always mean love. Reproduction in history often followed the path of power. To see Genghis Khan's DNA as miracle or curse depends on how one interprets the arithmetic of survival. Back in the lab, scientists double-checked their data. Could coincidence explain such uniformity? Maybe some unknown Central Asian lineage happened to thrive by chance. But geography betrayed the answer. The highest frequency of the haplotype sat precisely in Mongolia, decreasing gradually outward along the same corridors once patrolled by Mongol horsemen. Every control test reinforced the same conclusion. Something or someone originating near the homeland of Genghis Khan had left an imprint so vast it reached from China to Uzbekistan. They began referring to the phenomenon informally as the Genghis Khan effect. In a sense, the steppe had found a new way to conquer, the genetic frontier replacing the battlefield. To grasp the sheer scale, picture modern maps. The combined male population from regions once under Mongol rule, China, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and parts of Russia, numbers in the billions. If even 1 to 2% of these men share the same direct paternal ancestor, it means one individual's Y chromosome spread at a pace of expansion unprecedented in recorded history. Not even Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar left such a measurable trace. Science had turned rumor into quantifiable legacy, and the discoveries echoed through both academic circles and popular imagination. Genghis Khan's immortality was no longer spiritual or symbolic. It was biological. His genetic presence also forces us to rethink how civilization itself multiplies. Every empire from Rome to Britain spread its language, law, and culture. The Mongol Empire spread something more fundamental: genes. Its mobile armies, merchant networks, and systems of tribute facilitated unprecedented human exchange of goods, ideas, and people. Nomads moved artisans, traders intermarried with settlers, courts sent hostages as brides. The expansion of Mongol power acted as a global demographic centrifuge. mixing populations that had been isolated for millennia. Through that mixing, some lineages flourished, others vanished, and one, his, rose meteoric. Modern descendants might never know they carry a microscopic relic of that story. A shopkeeper in Samarkand, a farmer near Beijing, a student in Baku, all statistically more likely than not part of the invisible dynasty. For them, the connection doesn't change appearance or fate. It reminds us instead how history hides inside us. Unlike monuments that crumble, DNA records events silently. Every double helix in our cells is a library of survival, and sometimes the authors are conquerors. But the discovery also opens philosophical questions. What does it mean that one of humanity's most violent conquerors also became one of its most prolific ancestors? Are we wired to reward aggression at a genetic level? Or is it coincidence that power, privilege, and fertility have so often walked hand in hand? To look at Genghis Khan's genome is to glimpse the neutral face of evolution, indifferent to morality. Nature doesn't care if a father was tyrant or saint. It only counts who reproduces. Still, there's poetry in knowing that modern science found answers where history paused. Chroniclers recorded his victories, but not his biology. They praised his vision of unity under heaven. None imagined that unity would one day be proven through chromosomes. 8 centuries after his death, computers have drawn the shape of his legacy better than any praise song from the steppe could. Somewhere within its nested spirals, 15 or 16 million lives whisper a single word: continuity. So the camera drifts from the microscope back to the Mongolian plains. Horses graze under sweeping stars. The wind that once carried the scream of battles now carries only silence. Yet within that silence, millions of heartbeats echo his name unconsciously. The world he built is gone. The empire that replaced it forgotten. But inside bodies of strangers separated by culture, race and distance, the old general's ancestry hums quietly like a mantra of survival. That is the ghost in our blood, the unseen empire that no fire could burn nor time erase, and it is only the beginning of our story. The steppe in the 12th century stretched like an ocean with no water, an endless tide of grass that rippled beneath brutal winds. There were no cities, no walls, only the rhythm of hoofbeats and the smell of smoke from felt tents scattered across horizons. Survival here was not a right. It was a negotiation renewed each dawn. Winter could strip a family bare before the first snow fully touched the ground, and summer could drown whole herds in sudden floods. Hunger erased pride, and pride often replaced mercy. The people of the steppe lived within a world balanced between freedom and famine, where a single drought could turn friend into raider before the moon changed shape. In that environment, community was everything and nothing. A clan could lift you to safety or cast you into oblivion. Allegiance didn't rest on ideology or permanent loyalty. It was about food, safety, and vengeance. Bonds were kept sealed through blood, marriage, or mutual fear. Every horse, every bow, every child counted toward a clan's capacity to survive. A man's value was measured first by the strength of his kin, and second by the promises he could make in battle. Tribes rose and fell as easily as the tides of the Grass Sea. One year's protector could become next year's enemy. Out there, history was written not in ink, but in scars. Temujin was born into this world of shifting loyalties and impatient skies. Around the year 1162, near the Onon River, his father, Yesuge, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigan clan, and his mother, Huelun, a woman of uncommon resilience, who had herself been seized from another tribe during a raid. From the very beginning, Temujin's life was a blueprint for the ferocious simplicity of the steppe. Survival through conquest, family through force. His birthright consisted of a few horses, a handful of yurts, and an unbroken view of danger in every direction. As a boy, Temujin was taught to hunt, ride, and kill with the efficiency of necessity. A child here learned early what failure tasted like. It was hunger. When he was 9, his father arranged a marriage alliance with a nearby tribe to secure future political ties, sending the boy to live with his future in-laws. But on a journey home from that arrangement, Yasuge was poisoned by rival Tatars during a feast. His death shattered the fragile web of loyalty holding their clan together. Without paternal leadership, the family was abandoned overnight, cast out to fend for themselves on an unforgiving plain. Those years carved Temujin's destiny with a knife. His family hunted wild roots and rodents. They stripped bark off trees to survive winter. His mother melted snow to feed her children, reminding them daily that no one, not even family, could be trusted to protect them. Temujin's world shrank to hunger and vengeance. When elder clans refused to help, his concept of loyalty twisted into something sharp. He learned that trust without strength is a death sentence. As he grew, so did his observation of that unrelenting social ecosystem. Raiding was not crime, it was commerce. To raid meant to feed one's kin. To steal a bride meant to forge an alliance. War, reproduction, and economy were all the same act performed on different stages. When livestock, grain, or pasture ran short, tribes took what they needed from others. And when men fell in those raids, widows and daughters became part of victors' camps, binding their genes and grudges to the new tribe. Over centuries, this practice braided violence and kinship together until the two were inseparable. Every child born carried both inheritance and revenge. In that moral logic, victory wasn't complete until it left offspring, the ultimate proof that one's bloodline had triumphed. Temujin's adolescence was a litany of betrayals that hardened his belief in self-reliance. After his father's death, some relatives enslaved him, fitting him with a wooden collar to prevent escape. The boy slipped free under cover of night, hiding for days in icy reeds beside a river. That moment, chains to freedom became his first conquest. He learned that strength must come from cunning as much as courage, and any structure of power not personally controlled could collapse by dawn. He slowly gathered followers, outcasts like himself, men owed to no chief, but drawn to a leader who radiated focus instead of fury. He proved his loyalty differently, sharing meat after hunts, punishing theft, rewarding merit before birthright. In a culture obsessed with bloodlines, this was revolutionary. Each small alliance he formed rewrote the unwritten rule of the steppe, that strength lay not in heritage but in cohesion. His peers began calling him Temujin the Firm, the one who could hold together what others broke. But before he could command others, he had to reclaim his family's stolen honor. He tracked down the Taichi-Ud clan who had enslaved him, attacked their camp and took their leaders prisoner. Unlike common raiders who slaughtered captives, he spared them, offering integration for obedience. Mercy became his form of dominance. Every man spared owed him a life. Every family kept intact became his extended network. Through warfare tempered with clemency, Temujin began to substitute fear with allegiance. He was reinventing conquest as diplomacy. Even at this early stage, one can see the seed of his later empire. He understood power as a social technology. To dominate many, a ruler had to weave love and terror so tightly they became indistinguishable. In steppe life, bonds could only be maintained through constant exchange of wives, of livestock, of vengeance. Temujin turned that rhythm into a system, building loyalty by redistributing plunder rather than hoarding it. This created both wealth and obligation, linking warriors directly to him rather than to their tribal elders. Power began, as always, in the family body, but Temujin extended that body until the entire army became its skeleton. Meanwhile, the cultural physics of the steppe continued to define morality. A successful man was expected to produce sons, horses, and territory. Sexual dominance was social proof. To die without heirs meant erasure as surely as death in battle. When Temujin began seizing the possessions of enemy clans, he also took their women, sometimes to consolidate revenge, sometimes to build alliances, but increasingly as tokens of succession. Each marriage expanded his kinship web, transforming desire into strategy. Power, reproduction, and survival merged like intertwined reins. To control one was to ride the others. By the time he reached manhood, Temujin had already witnessed every form of betrayal, hunger and cruelty his world could offer. And he learned one other secret, that order could rise from the chaos of desperation. Where older chiefs saw endless cycles of vengeance, he saw the possibility of unity. The steppe's tribes bound not through fear of winter, but through shared ambition. Yet under that vision still burned the raw law of nature he'd grown up with. Those who cannot protect their kin do not deserve them. That philosophy would remain his compass for life. Temujin's story, before it became legend, was simply a lesson in survival mathematics. Family equaled strength. Abandonment equaled extinction. When people starved, they raided. When they triumphed, they multiplied. His early struggle condensed centuries of steppe logic into one living example. And from this crucible of hunger and humiliation, the boy forged a conviction that the only unbreakable alliance is the one sealed in blood, whether by inheritance or by conquest. Temujin's world changed the moment strength began to gather around him like magnetic dust. Life on the plains had taught everyone to read the direction of the wind. They could sense another storm forming, this time not of weather but of will. The small band he had built grew into a disciplined group of dozens, then hundreds, bound less by ancestry than by loyalty, a concept still foreign to older chiefs. For centuries, the steppe's horizon had been broken into fragments of clans separated by grudges. Temujin's camp became a quiet revolution. He was turning fragments into structure, chaos into a single arrow pointed outward. The organization of his forces reflected the lessons of his youth. Warfare here wasn't an art, it was an element, continuous and necessary. Every raid demanded endurance, every retreat required speed. So he reduced all authority to simplicity. 10 men reported to one to another, 10, and upward until thousands moved as a single breathing creature. It was military design born not from palaces, but from the pulse of survival, lean, fast, built on trust forged in hardship. Unlike older lords who gave command to relatives, Temujin promoted warriors by merit. Courage became currency. Loyalty law. For the first time in steppe memory, bloodline stood below competence. In the brief pauses between wars, tribal councils gathered to discuss livestock, marriages, and vengeance. Here, amid fermented mare's milk and the rhythmic beating of drums, alliances were sealed and broken in the space between cups. Temujin learned to treat these gatherings as battlefields of words, every toast a negotiation, every gift a weapon. He gave horses instead of threats, daughters instead of insults. People accepted his generosity because they saw that his camp never went hungry. The spoils he distributed ensured that no follower remained poor, and gratitude slowly replaced tradition as glue binding his tribe. But not everyone welcomed his rise. Old nobles saw in him a thief of heritage, a man without ancient title daring to speak of unity. To them he was bastard of ambition, and ambition frightened men whose power rested on inheritance. Several times they tried to cut him down through ambushes and betrayal. Once an ambush left him wounded, crawling beneath the moon with an arrow through his neck. He survived by cauterizing the wound with the blade of his own knife, breathing through sparks and pain. His followers took that survival as omen. Even the steppe itself could not kill him. Stories grew faster than enemies could contain them. As the tribes clashed and converged, the steppes became laboratory for natural selection accelerated by politics. The ruthless secured resources, the cunning secured loyalty, and the fruitful secured continuity. Through that lens, the Mongol plain functioned like a living experiment in human evolution. Those who could not adapt vanished into smoke. In this arena where death equaled silence, lineage was not just a record of the past, but a strategy for future victory. Marriage alliances extended armies as effectively as conquests did. The idea that blood could rule beyond death flourished, and Temujin absorbed it like scripture. He began to view kinship as empire, waiting to be born inside the wombs of future generations. The call for unity among tribes was not rhetoric, it was necessity. The Chinese to the southeast saw the steppes as a resource to exploit, buying loyalty with silk and wine, hiring one clan to fight another. Temujin realized that as long as Mongols stayed divided, they were weapons for others to use. Unifying them required more than charisma. It demanded faith in something larger. So he began preaching an almost religious doctrine, that the eternal blue sky had chosen him to bring order where chaos reigned. The message worked. Destiny replaced doubt for a people who endured cycles of hunger and revenge. Believing that their hardship had purpose gave them reason to follow. Temujin's transformation into Genghis Khan came gradually, like dawn sneaking over mountains before people noticed the light. Victories multiplied. Kyrgyz, Merkits, Tatars all fell in turn. Each conquest stitched another piece of the steppe into his fabric. Rather than annihilate enemies completely, he absorbed survivors, adding their warriors and women into his camp. The technique turned opposition into fuel. Every tribe destroyed supplied human resources that made the next battle possible. The compounding of conquest mirrored the compounding of bloodlines. Those who lost sons to him might gain grandsons through marriage into his clan. By the turn of the century, Genghis Khan was no mere ruler. He was ecosystem remodeled around his will. At campfires under auroras, bards already sang that he rode with the spirits of wolves, that the stars themselves circled him as guard. Such mythology wasn't coincidence. It was soft power weaving together fear and admiration. To obey him began to feel like obeying the laws of nature. Kings who rule by ordinary force fade. Those who make submission feel like harmony endure. Genghis Khan understood this instinctively. He wasn't conquering only through steel, but through story. The idea that resisting him was resisting fate. Yet beneath prophecy lurked the biological truth of empire. Where he went, reproduction followed. Victorious generals were rewarded with daughters of allies, wives of enemies, concubines from conquered rulers. The Khan himself took women from nearly every region he subdued. Such unions were partly politics, partly instinct, the primal language of continuity. Each birth under his lineage stitched power deeper into the social fabric. In the steppes' logic, domination verified itself through children bearing the Conqueror's name. By the standards of his world, this was not immorality. It was immortality. When he looked across the endless grasslands that had once rejected him, perhaps he understood the strange equation he embodied. Every life denied him as a boy had now multiplied into thousands, pledged to him as men. Every meal stolen from hunger-born mother cities, every betrayal had become blueprint for empire. The hunger that had nearly killed him now devoured nations. The storm he birthed was more than army. It was idea. That unity enforced through fear could bring peace through control. And so, from a starving orphan bound in a wooden collar, rose a man destined to collar half the world. The rise of Genghis Khan was not miracle, but inevitability forged by environment. The steppe was both parent and teacher. It erased the weak, rewarded the ruthless, and crowned those who could turn pain into purpose. He was its purest son, the storm the grass itself had raised. Standing atop a ridge before his first great invasion, he felt the wind whip across his face, the same wind that had once slammed his family's tent in hunger years past. Now its roar sounded like applause. In its voice he heard the prophecy the world was about to learn. No power grows stronger than the one born of survival. Within that wind began the empire, and within that empire, the unseen blueprint of 16 million future lives. When the steppe finally quieted after decades of raiding and revenge, Temujin stood at its center as the only man capable of turning its turmoil into order. Once an outcast chained in a wooden yoke, he had become a power that no tribe could ignore. But it was not brute force that transformed the fugitive into Genghis Khan. It was the construction of a new social spine. For centuries, the steppes had worked like a spinning wheel of conflict, every alliance temporary, every oath conditional, every injury inherited. Where others saw chaos, Temujin saw raw material. His genius lay in turning personal loyalty into the cement of empire. When he called the Kurultai, the great assembly of the tribes, the plains filled with campfires stretching to the horizon. Tens of thousands gathered, chieftains, warriors, shamans, horse herders, merchants trailing livestock and spoils. The air smelled of sweat, horse dung, fermented milk, and anticipation. The meeting was both political and symbolic, a final gamble to convert survival into structure. Temujin rode into the gathering in plain armor, not gilded or jeweled, and instead of boasting of ancestry, he spoke of fairness. The root of disorder, he said, is men fighting for their own clan, not for all. He called upon them to unite as a single Mongol nation. For the first time, the word Mongol meant something larger than blood. The decision that followed was half destiny, half persuasion. The chiefs raised him on a felt carpet and declared him Khan over all Mongols, Genghis Khan, universal ruler. The title itself was revolutionary. No past leader had claimed to rule the entire sky. The moment ached with symbolism, an orphaned child of betrayal coronated by the same system that once abandoned him. Drums thundered as shamans sprinkled mare's milk on the crowd for blessing, and riders galloped outward to announce the new world being born. Yet kingship was only the beginning. Genghis Khan understood that rule built on emotion would die with emotion. He had to invent a political architecture that could outlast his heartbeat. His first reform cut at the foundation of tribal hierarchy. In place of kin loyalty, he built units based on tens, 10, 100,000, and 10,000, each commanded by officers chosen for merit, not lineage. The decimal structure looked mathematical, but its implications were spiritual. Warriors now fought for competence and comradeship, not relatives. In a landscape obsessed with family honor, the change felt unnatural, even sacrilegious. But success is its own religion. Discipline soon gave them precision that no neighboring army could match. Battles that once dissolved into chaos became choreographed thunder. The second reform was the Yasa, a vast code of law that combined old steppe custom with new discipline. The Yasa declared theft punishable by death, demanded loyalty to command, forbade feuding among allies, and required the sharing of spoils to prevent jealousy. It standardized taxes, decreed religious tolerance, and even established environmental rules protecting rivers and pastures. In the hands of a despot, such a code could have been pure control. In the hands of Genghis Khan, it became survival mechanism. His laws converted chaos into predictability, ensuring that a merchant or farmer under his rule knew what to expect in war or peace. For nomads, that certainty was rarer than gold. He revolutionized communication next, building the YAM system, a network of postal stations and relay riders linked by fresh horses every 30 or 40 kilometers. What began as battlefield convenience became an artery system of the empire. A message could travel thousands of kilometers in days, uniting lands that had never before shared information with speed. Local messengers were bound to the Khan's service through duty and reward, forming the world's first organized courier network, a Mongolian internet of saddles and hoofbeats. This new heartbeat of exchange allowed him to control provinces hundreds of miles apart, as if they were neighboring tents. All these reforms fed one goal: turn fractured tribes into one organism, beating under a single pulse. Through that unity, the Mongols birthed not only an empire but an ecological shift. The constant feuding that had bled the grasslands for generations ceased. Herds returned, trade caravans flourished, caravansaries rose where ambushes once ruled. If the wind used to carry cries of vengeance, it now carried the hum of coordination. Still, unity came at a price. Each reform eroded old power structures, and resentment brewed among those who had profited from chaos. The tribal elite feared disappearing into the rank of a faceless army. Rumors spread that the Yasa was witchcraft, a spell that bound men's wills. Some whispered that Genghis Khan was playing God, rewriting human nature. He countered dissent the same way he had survived his youth: swift punishment, mixed with strategic mercy. A few executions here, a generous feast there, and rebellion melted back into obedience. He didn't need love. He needed belief, and belief was easier to cultivate than affection. At its core, the new Mongol nation was a social experiment born out of trauma. It replaced kin with creed, superstition with structure. Genghis Khan demanded that all pillars, military, legal, spiritual, lean toward one center: himself. Yet this was not narcissism. The empire's cohesion functioned as an extension of his body. Every commander was an arm, every soldier a finger, every family a cell replicating his vision. He had turned politics into biology. This was also when bloodlines began to merge under his banner, not just politically but physically. Marriages multiplied to secure loyalties long before treaties could. A conquered clan might give daughters to his officers to guarantee their safety. Rival chiefs sent sisters and nieces to his household as pledges of peace. What started as diplomacy evolved into assimilation. The Mongol gene pool began its expansion, mixing once hostile families into a single sprawling lineage. The more tribes he united, the more that unity expressed itself in blood. Children born from these unions carried heritage from opposite ends of ancient feuds, genetic allegories of peace imposed by force. By the time the last holdout tribes submitted, the transformation of a wandering band into the largest nomadic civilization in history was complete, though most of the world had yet to notice. Inside those felt tents, warriors hardened by starvation now discussed navigation, taxation, and law. The conversations once confined to survival had turned philosophical. Some asked if this new order would last beyond the Khan's lifetime. Others wondered if peace among Mongols meant inevitable war with everyone else. Genghis Khan's silence during such moments was telling. He was no longer thinking about unity as destination. It was fuel for expansion. The world beyond the steppe would soon feel the consequences. When he looked outward, to China's fortified kingdoms, to the Silk Roads guarded by mercenaries, to the proud cities of Central Asia, he saw resources, wealth, and destiny waiting to be absorbed. The unification of the tribes had completed phase one of a larger design. He now commanded not scattered riders, but an empire in embryo. The next step was to let it breathe. Internal observers sensed the atmospheric change like animals before storm. Messengers galloped across the plains, carrying orders to muster. Blacksmiths hammered night and day, forging arrowheads. Herds multiplied to supply future campaigns. The entire Mongol nation collectively inhaled, in preparation for a century-long exhale that would reach Europe's castles and Arabia's deserts. For those closest to him, the realization was both intoxicating and terrifying. The long, fractured steppe, once chain of rival families, had turned into one family with a single, insatiable will. The Mongols' new sense of identity spread faster than any proclamation could travel. Children born in the years following Temujin's coronation grew up knowing only one master and one set of laws. They treated loyalty to the Khan as natural as breathing. To them, tribal names were little more than dialects of an older tongue no longer spoken. In a generation, centuries of inherited hostility thinned into memory. The campfires that had once burned in isolation now flamed in unison, dotting the horizon like scattered constellations under the eternal sky. The Mongol nation had become self-aware, a single organism with one heartbeat. Genghis Khan understood that this unity needed ritual to survive. He convened festivals that acted as both military drills and social theater. Every spring, warriors from every clan gathered to renew allegiance and test their horses across endless fields. There were competitions of archery and wrestling, feasts that consumed entire herds, and ceremonies honoring ancestral spirits. While they seemed celebratory, they reinforced rank and obedience. Each participant could feel the invisible net binding them to a larger purpose. These gatherings were rehearsal for global governance, a reminder that law and fellowship were now inseparable. To sustain momentum, he fused spiritual sanction with political logic. Shamans declared that heavenly signs, the flight of hawks, sudden storms, eclipses, proved the eternal blue sky favored the Khan's rule. The divine and the practical intertwined until rebellion seemed not only futile, but sacrilegious. A ruler commanding both sword and spirit faced no equal in a world still run by clan elders and superstition, yet his own belief in the sky god was absolute. Arrogance did not fill him with doubt, but with clarity. He saw himself as instrument, not deity. The universe, he believed, demanded order, and he would provide it. The reforms he had already implemented began to show unintended strength. The courier relay added strategic intelligence. Merchants safe under Mongol protection became informants, spreading news of distant opportunities. Artisans and scholars caught in raids were brought back to his tent and questioned about their crafts and cities. Each piece of information became stone in the bridge between the nomad and the world of walls. As those fragments assembled, Genghis Khan's horizon widened beyond survival to legacy. If his people could rule themselves by rule rather than lineage, why could not others? In ambition's alchemy, self-defense turned into expansion. Preparation for the first major campaigns had a rhythm like weather shifting. Scouts traced routes through the Altai Mountains and into the lands of the Xia dynasty. Negotiators rode east to demand tribute and safe passage for emerging trade. The responses were dismissive at best, insulting at worst. When an envoy returned beaten and shorn, the Khan's decision crystallized. An insult to his messenger was an insult to the balance he had worked so hard to create. Order, he believed, could not exist halfway. Peace required conversion, and conversion sometimes required fire. Before the first invasion, he addressed his generals under a white banner, the Sulde that represented his soul. The scene was stark. A still night, horses restless, stars open above them. He spoke without flourish. The tribes are one body. Let the world test its strength. What began as unification would now expand as destiny. The Mongols had been enclosed by nothing for too long. The sky itself seemed to demand movement. Within weeks, Tumans divided and rode east toward still-sleeping fortresses, carrying not only bows and lances, but the invisible confidence of shared purpose. The campaign against the Xia tested everything he had built. Discipline held under pressure. Fractured clans fought side by side. His codified hierarchy made transitions between battle and diplomacy seamless. After each victory, he forbade unnecessary slaughter, a gesture that carried both mercy and message. The conqueror who had once starved now fed his enemies in exchange for allegiance. He would rather convert than kill. Each surrendered city added to his army and his bloodline. The populace of conquered lands often found Mongol justice simpler than their own rulers' corruption. The Khan's empire grew because obedience was easier than resistance. As territory expanded, so did the cultural and genetic blending that followed his armies. Soldiers married local women according to custom or decree. Children were raised bilingual, embodying both conqueror and conquered. Within a single lifetime, Mongol blood mixed with Turkic, Persian, Khitan, Tangut, and countless others. What had begun as a political revolution became an unseen biological one. His unity of tribes turned into unity of people in the physical sense. When future scientists traced the pattern centuries later, they would read these unions as lines on a genetic map. But in his time, they were simply the practical work of empire building. In the midst of expansion, the Khan never forgot the lessons that birthed him. He audited his own commanders harshly. A single act of arrogance or cruelty that broke his code could cost a general everything. Word of those punishments spread quickly, ensuring lower ranks maintained discipline. Yet he rewarded wisdom lavishly. A small invention, a clever tactic, a saved life, all merited honor. That balance of fear and recognition kept the empire pliant but alive. It was the echo of his childhood insight that love alone failed. Fear alone corroded, but combined they forged steel. By the campaign's end, the Mongols controlled routes stretching from the Siberian forests to the edges of northern China. Caravans under his protection carried goods farther and faster than ever before. Peace came not from treaties but from exhaustion of opposition. For the first time in steppe memory, a traveler could cross entire horizons without facing an enemy unyielding to the Khan. Genghis Khan returned to his capital at the Onon with both spoils and vision renewed. He watched riders arrive from distant lands bearing tribute, horses, silk, spices, iron, and saw in that flow the pulse of a world newly connected. In his council tent, maps drawn on cloth grew crowded with marks for cities, rivers, and mountain passes. He understood instinctively that the unification of the tribes had not ended in ceremony. It was the seed of something global. The family he had built from broken alliances would merge with others until the entire known world became one extended kinship network tied by loyalty, law, and occasionally blood. The wind through his tent sang the same haunting tone he had heard as a boy hiding from his captors. Once it spoke of isolation, now it carried the breath of millions. The fugitive had become the axis of history. Every reform, from the Yasa to the postal riders, from merit to marriage, formed pieces of a massive design, an empire that would rewrite genetics as surely as it rewrote maps. The unification of the tribes was more than political, more than military. It was the ignition of a chain reaction that would scatter his legacy, invisible and enduring through centuries and across continents. Somewhere within that unending wind was already the whisper of 16 million heartbeats yet unborn, all tracing back to the man who had risen from hunger to forge a world in his own likeness, and who had taught the steppes to move as one. The Mongol armies moved like a tide that ignored geography. Once the tribes had been welded into one organism, that organism began to spill outward, carrying with it the silent conviction that the sky itself had blessed their motion. In the early 1200s, when the Khan turned his gaze east toward the Jin dynasty of northern China, few in the walled cities believed horsemen from the steppe could break the defenses that centuries of empires had built. Yet his riders were not the old raiders who vanished after stealing cattle. They were disciplined, networked, and trained to think as parts of a single mind. They advanced in waves, coordinated by flaming arrows, drums, and flags, like muscles obeying a heartbeat. The invasion began as one of the most organized military campaigns in human memory. Fortresses fell in sequence. Supply depots emptied before defenders understood an army had come. Mongol engineers reverse-engineered Chinese siegecraft within weeks, adapting catapults and gunpowder projectiles. When caves along rivers concealed fugitives, they redirected rivers to drown them. Tactics evolved daily. Strategy never changed, total assimilation or annihilation. The disciplined cruelty shocked both enemies and chroniclers. Cities that resisted were erased, inhabitants executed or relocated, while those that surrendered fed and supplied the army. It was a pragmatic algorithm of fear and reward that extended farther than conventional conquest ever could. To the Mongols, victory was less about land than obedience. The world was a wheel meant to spin around their axis. In 1211, the Jin capital, Zhongdu, modern Beijing, felt that wheel roll over it. The siege lasted months. Smoke from burning towers mixed with the odor of thousands of unburied corpses. When the gates finally opened, Genghis Khan's troops entered in silence. Rebuilding later was allowed. Defiance was not. The city's architects, scholars, and artisans were spared, relocated to serve imperial workshops across Asia. This pattern, the scattering of skill rather than massacre of knowledge, became typical. The destruction brought paradoxical creation. Wherever Mongol fires cooled, they left behind roads, bridges, and protections for traders who had once navigated deserts at the mercy of thieves. From China, the conqueror turned west. Central Asia's caravan cities, Bukhara, Samarkand, Nishapur, stood glittering along the Silk Road, mosaics of faith and wealth anchored by mosques and bazaars. They seemed eternal. In 1219, Genghis Khan demanded safe trade rights from the Khwarezmian Empire, whose ruler Shah Ala al-Din Muhammad dismissed the request and executed a Mongol envoy. That single insult unleashed retribution on a continental scale. The Mongol army, estimated between 1 and 200,000, crossed ice, river and desert to reach Bukhara. Chroniclers later wrote that they moved with speed that belonged to demons. When Bukhara's minarets crumbled, Genghis Khan entered the city's main mosque and climbed its pulpit. Instead of delivering prayers, he addressed the trembling population. "If you had not sinned greatly," he said, "the eternal blue sky would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." It was theater and theology at once, the conqueror presenting himself as divine correction. Within hours the city was stripped of treasure, and blame spread equally to nobles and merchants. Yet, as always, artisans were parceled out and spared to rebuild under the empire's banner. Every new ruin became Mongol industry's quarry. Behind the brutality ran another quieter current. Victories produced wealth, and wealth financed loyalty. Generals who razed cities received portions of captured populations as rewards. High officers selected daughters of governors and merchants to cement future alliances. From one embroidered yurt to another, marriage and concubinage replaced diplomacy. The empire's geography of desire expanded almost as fast as its armies. For the Mongols, polygyny served two ends: political stability and biological immortality. To grant a wife was to grant legitimacy. To bear a child was to root loyalty in flesh. At the top of this pyramid stood Genghis Khan himself, the patriarch of patriarchs. His personal family mirrored his empire's structure, vast, interlinked, fractal. Records describe several official wives, the foremost being Berta, his lifelong partner, and the woman whose kidnapping years earlier had sparked some of his first campaigns. Loyalty to her never faded, but royal duty demanded multiplication. Each major conquest brought new unions with princesses or noblewomen of defeated nations, not as indulgence but as statecraft. When a queen entered his household, her family's territory effectively joined the empire. The harem became a parliament of conquered thrones. Historians estimate that the royal house of Genghis Khan expanded through sons and grandchildren, numbered in the thousands by the time of his death. Each son governed vast realms: Yochi in the far west, Chagatai in Central Asia, Ogaday in Mongolia, Tolui near China, and each repeated the pattern of prolific marriage. The steppes' moral logic supported it. Many sons meant many heirs. Many heirs meant security for the lineage. The harem was not simply indulgence but insurance. As empire required constant campaigning, mortality among leaders was high. Only overwhelming reproduction could maintain the dynasty's breadth. For the common Mongol, this elite fertility was distant myth, yet its benefits trickled down. Captive women and children became property transferred to soldiers, ensuring personal rewards tied to collective success. The carrot of accompaniment replaced simple plunder as motivation. Where older raiders fought for cattle, Mongols fought for legacy, for permission to build micro-kingdoms under the Great One. Behind the thunder of hooves lay quieter dramas: marriages arranged under tents, women renamed in Mongolian tongues, children born blending features from dozens of tribes. Yet historians who emphasize conquest often miss Genghis Khan's second empire. the network of reproduction that shadowed his armies. In less than 40 years, his lineage infiltrated an area 4 times larger than that of Rome. The result was demographic realignment on an evolutionary scale. Populations vanished through slaughter, but also through absorption. Others multiplied under new dynastic names. The genetic impact radiated like an aftershock. Even in his lifetime, courtiers spoke of the seed of the Khan spreading with the inevitability of dawn. If the sword cut empires apart, his blood stitched them back together. The scale of his ambition approached the cosmic. After China and Central Asia, he sent emissaries to Persia and Russia, demanding submission in letters that mixed scripture and threat. Some complied. Most hesitated and paid the price. The pattern repeated. Envoy slain, invasion unleashed, cities erased. The moral equation was terrifying and effective. To resist meant extinction. To surrender meant integration. Across thousands of miles, merchants began thanking Mongols for reopening routes once too dangerous to traverse. It was paradox moralized. The destroyer as protector, the killer as custodian of order. Even as the empire expanded, its inner genetics deepened. Daughters of conquered kings married sons of generals. Half-Mongol princes ruled hybrid courts speaking 5 languages, yet addressing decrees in the name of Genghis Khan. From Karakoram to Bukhara, populations mixed so rapidly that ethnicity itself began to blur. The empire became a human centrifuge, spinning genes, customs, and ambitions through one another, until pure Mongol identity was replaced by spectrum. Beneath banners depicting wolves and suns, children of every complexion rode as kin. Still, for all the pragmatic tolerance, the conquest's physical toll was unimaginable. Historians estimate that tens of millions died during these campaigns, numbers numbing to comprehension. When chroniclers attempted math, they collapsed into poetry, describing lands where grass would not grow because of bones. The paradox of Genghis Khan's legacy lies exactly here. That mankind's greatest wave of destruction produced one of its lasting networks of connection. Trade multiplied under his secure roots. Letters of exchange traveled farther. Ideas about astronomy, medicine, and printing crossed boundaries. As walls fell, roads grew. Civilization shed its skin through violence and emerged differently shaped. Inside the imperial camp, however, continuity and fertility remained the unspoken obsession. Envoys negotiating future marriages wrote about the endless rank of royal tents surrounding the Khan zone, a city of women guarded by elite soldiers. Each tent represented an alliance, a geography, an echo of victory. The dynasty measured success not only in conquered miles, but in infants. Each crying newborn was a piece of history insured against time, a small immortalization of the man who had believed that destiny itself favored his line. In the years after Samarkand and Nishapur fell, even the rhythm of devastation became organized routine. The Mongol army moved like a hive, each division governed by the same mathematical discipline that had unified the tribes. Scouts rode ahead like feelers, sensing weakness. Engineers followed with siege machines built from dismantled city gates. Behind them came scribes who recorded logistics and births, merchants who reopened routes, and priests of every faith invited to preach peace under Mongol protection. This paradox, merciless destruction followed by almost bureaucratic reconstruction, became the empire's signature. The world had never seen violence so systematic or administration so efficient. When the campaign turned south into Persia, the pattern deepened. Genghis Khan's troops arrived in waves that blurred winter and summer together. Entire provinces learned that surrender was cheaper than pride. The first governor who opened his gates found his city preserved. The next who resisted saw his walls leveled and survivors dispersed to other Mongol towns. From these tactics grew reputation, terror as intelligence. The idea moved faster than the armies themselves. Submission saved lives. Diplomats arrived at camps carrying silk and horses before arrows ever flew. In the stillness of those negotiations, temples of fire and mosques echoed the same prayer for mercy, discovering that the new world spoke not in the language of faith, but of compliance. Within this expanding arena, Mongol military discipline crossed into social engineering. Settlements destroyed one month were repopulated the next by mixed families, a deliberate policy to prevent rebellion and seed allegiance. Captives from one end of the empire were relocated thousands of kilometers away. Resentment dissolved into adaptation. The demographics of Central Eurasia blurred until historians centuries later could no longer trace the borders by ancestry. Genghis Khan was not only redrawing maps, he was redistributing humanity. His headquarters evolved into something between mobile capital and earthly constellation. Scores of moving palaces shimmering with silk banners, populated by administrators, astrologers, concubines, and hostages turned allies. French chroniclers would later compare the Khan's camp to a migrating city, self-sustaining and self-replicating. Each march carried within it all classes of life: warriors birthing children, artisans forging goods, priests blessing both. The army fed itself by creating miniature civilizations that could strike, rebuild, and move before the ashes cooled. At the axis of this organism sat the Khan's household, part throne room, part biological laboratory of politics. Bertha retained her senior status, ruling over the royal encampment with authority equal to a governor's. Under her came secondary wives from conquered dynasties, each with her own tent, servants, and guards. Some ruled satellite camps hundreds of kilometers apart, governing according to his decree. In these private circles, empire and intimacy were indistinguishable. Each union merged two political realities: conquest by force and alliance by reproduction. Chroniclers describe the harem not as hidden luxury, but as an administrative network. Women there were literate, multilingual, accustomed to attending council on behalf of their absent lord. The Khan's daughters and daughters-in-law managed territories and served as royal envoys. To be connected by blood to him was both privilege and burden. Every one of his women was both symbol and instrument of diplomacy. When neighboring rulers resisted submission, they sometimes received offers instead of ultimatums. If accepted, those marriages elevated their families into the empire's broader web. Refuse, and the offer returned as invasion. Marriage became a weapon with a smile. Genghis Khan's personal fertility turned myth even in his lifetime. Songs composed by loyal bards claimed the heavens had promised him descendants, as many as stars reflected on a river. Envoys from Persia and India wrote letters addressed to the Father of Nations. While such words praised glory, they also hid moral unease. What kind of humanity births itself atop ruins? His contemporaries rarely dared to answer. Beneath the myth, daily details betray a pragmatic machine. After major campaigns, the Khan held feasts where captured women were inspected by court officials who paired them with officers based on rank and merit. The chosen were recorded in scrolls, so no jealousy could ignite later quarrels. It was allocation, not romance, reward system disguised as ritual. To modernize, it appears horrific. To the steppe it was efficiency. The body was currency. Lineage was investment. With expansion westward, new cultures folded into the pattern. As Mongols entered the Caucasus and the Volga, they absorbed Turkic clans and even pockets of European migrants. Reports from Venetian merchants described blue-eyed soldiers calling each other brothers under banners of the wolf. This genetic blending, repeated across generations, created waves of divergence that scientists centuries later would struggle to calculate. What the sword destroyed, the womb repopulated. Under the philosophy of Genghis Khan, absence itself was opportunity. Stories circulated through conquered regions about the mysterious justice inside his empire. Traders from Baghdad and Kiev were astonished to travel for months without being robbed. Roads patrolled by soldiers ensured safety unheard of since Roman times. Taxes were standardized. Scribes maintained receipts. For the first time in centuries, a craftsman could sell ceramics in Samarkand made with clay from China. Peace came dressed in the garments of empire. Yet everyone knew that peace was conditional, secured by the same brutality that enforced it. Cities prospered only until the Khan's patience frayed. People worshipped him with mixtures of gratitude and dread. As the campaign slowed in the late 1220s, the empire's gravitational pull reached across oceans. Maps could no longer contain it. From Korea in the east to the Caspian Sea in the west, stretched one continuous military and genealogical network. Each new frontier produced more kin. Sons of soldiers oversaw remote districts. Grandsons of princesses commanded distant garrisons. None of it had central planning. Yet the outcome was mathematically perfect for propagation. Even if disease or rebellion erased half, the remaining half carried the bloodline to the next frontier. For the modern geneticist looking back, this stage marks the moment when one man's reproductive success transformed from legend to measurable phenomenon. Each son's descent multiplied through cohorts of attendants, guards and relatives taking wives among local populations. The Y chromosome pattern that scientists found centuries later owes its density to this precise historical moment, the years when politics and fertility moved at the same gallop. The empire was not only trading goods, it was exporting a genome. Genghis Khan had achieved what Charles Darwin would later define as the ultimate triumph of nature, differential reproduction on a staggering scale. And yet, behind every triumph hides contradiction. The streets of dead cities whispered its price. Those spared found themselves constructing new worlds upon bones of the old, unsure whether to praise or curse the conqueror who had so thoroughly reshaped human possibility. The idea that the fruit of such devastation could yield global stability baffled even contemporary accounts. Was order built on desolation still order? The Mongols never asked. For them, destiny required obedience, and obedience required survival. In Genghis Khan's final years, conquest and kinship became indistinguishable. His tent was filled with maps and infants, decrees and lullabies, future kings rocking beside exhausted scribes. He often said that heaven had stretched the world wide, so men could move freely across it. He had simply proven the prophecy true. When he rode at sunrise, guards saw him smile at flocks of birds rising from the grass, a vision of how his children would one day scatter. Even death could not find him easily. Every successor carried his face, his ambition, his algorithms of control. In 1227, during an expedition against the kingdom of Xixia, illness and age finally caught him. Legend says he ordered secrecy about his death until the campaign ended, fearing hesitation among soldiers. The army conquered, the secret held. His body slipped quietly into the earth beneath unmarked ground, but the empire refused to die. Sons divided realms as commanded, ensuring continuity not through tombstone but through offspring. Within a generation, his descendants ruled from the Pacific to the Black Sea, an empire spanned not only by law and army, but by DNA. Centuries later, scientists would translate that legacy into numbers, uncovering genetic fingerprints scattered across populations the world over. 16 million men share a pattern of inheritance that began somewhere in his saddlebag. His life had rewritten evolution, compressing the slow drift of millennia into one lifetime's thunder. And so the moral question lingers beyond the grave. Can the genius that unites the earth ever balance the grief it causes? Genghis Khan's empire built roads, libraries, and families, but those same roads were paved in ash. Perhaps his truest monument is neither city nor skeleton of power, but the paradox itself, a world both broken and connected by the same unstoppable hand. The story of Genghis Khan's genetic empire begins with the smallest frontier imaginable. A thread of DNA spiraled inside a cell. On the Y chromosome, one of humanity's paired sex chromosomes, lies history written not in ink or stone but in code. Unlike other chromosomes that recombine each generation, the Y passes almost perfectly intact from father to son, carrying with it a record of continuity that stretches backward through centuries, a biological surname that rarely changes spelling. Variations, when they occur, are simple mutations, a letter swapped, a pattern broken. These minute differences are the evolutionary timestamps that allow scientists to read prehistoric migrations as clearly as generals once read maps. Through this narrow corridor of inheritance, male lineages announce themselves. Anthropologists often compare the Y chromosome to a baton passed in an endless relay through time. If that baton is dropped, if a man dies childless, an entire strand of ancestry disappears. But if one man leaves many sons, and those sons multiply, the baton becomes a beam, spreading through generations like ripples widening on a pond. The science of population genetics studies such ripples, measuring how chance, conquest, and culture sculpt the tapestry of human inheritance. Behind the equations lies a basic logic. Who reproduces rules. Within this field, several key forces shape every population. The first is genetic drift, the statistical noise that makes some lineages shrink and others expand through random births and deaths. In small groups, a single generation's luck can erase or inflate entire families. The second is selection, which favors genes that increase survival or fertility. And then there is the founder effect, a demographic lottery that occurs when one individual or small group establishes a new population. If that founder's descendants prosper, their genetic signature dominates regardless of advantage. In the ancient world, where warfare and polygyny skewed reproduction dramatically, such effects were not occasional. They were systemic. Fertility, power, and inheritance intertwined so tightly that biology itself echoed politics. Great rulers were often both conquerors of land and patriarchs of overwhelming households. They created what modern geneticists call star clusters, lineages radiating outward from a single origin, forming unique haplotypes or sets of genetic markers that trace back to one ancestor. These haplotypes are essentially family crests etched into biology. One of the largest known star clusters sits on the Y chromosomal tree labeled C3, a lineage found across almost all of Asia. Its story begins near the Mongolian steppe. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Researchers at the University of Oxford and the University of Cambridge began compiling vast databases of human DNA samples, at first to map migration routes of early humans, but soon their attention turned to anomalies. Patterns emerged that defied normal expectations. Among nearly 40 populations ranging from Kazakhstan to Korea and from Siberia to the edge of Pakistan, scientists found a strangely homogeneous set of markers repeating again and again on the Y chromosome. The signature appeared so frequently that it couldn't be explained by coincidence. Using statistical modeling, they dated the common ancestor to roughly 800 years ago, 8 centuries, about the lifetime of Genghis Khan. Further geographic analysis showed the cluster's highest concentration centered on Mongolia and gradually thinning toward the territories once under Mongol control. When the news reached historians, disbelief turned into fascination. Here was molecular evidence of an empire that had outlived every city it conquered. An empire preserved in blood rather than architecture. The press called it the Genghis Khan haplotype, but scientists labeled it more soberly as the C3 Hall star cluster, though even they whispered the obvious connection. Statistically, there was almost no other individual in recorded history whose reach matched the data. The 2003 paper that unveiled the finding read like a detective novel written in numbers. Researchers genotyped clusters of microsatellites, repeated sequences that mutate at predictable rates, to estimate when different men around Eurasia had diverged from a shared paternal line. The resulting network diagram looked less like a tree and more like a solar system. One central node representing the origin, surrounded by countless orbiting descendants. When each data point was mapped onto physical geography, the image resembled an ember field stretching 8,000 kilometers. If every dot represented a living person, then 16 million embers still glowed, a living constellation tracing the invisible roots of conquest. To visualize this mathematically was to understand the biological scale of empire. Imagine a single Y chromosome journeying through time like a courier, passing through generations, copying itself, branching, yet seldom altering its central message. Where armies once galloped, their descendants' chromosomes now flicker silently in men testing their ancestry kits. In each of them, a small stretch of code reads as identically as if it were still handwriting in the great Khan's genome. Skeptics naturally asked whether the lineage truly belonged to him. Perhaps, they argued, another prolific patriarch from Central Asia. The Khans of later dynasties or tribal nobles predating Genghis was responsible. The scientists tested this idea by mapping spatial frequency. If the ancestor had been a minor noble, his genetic footprint would likely remain localized. Instead, the C32 cluster radiated outward precisely following Mongol expansion routes recorded in chronicles north into Siberia, south into China, west into Uzbekistan and beyond the Caspian Sea. Its diffusion was directional, not random, a genetic echo of cavalry migrations. One alternative hypothesis proposed that the lineage might trace to a group of related elites, not the Khan alone, perhaps his immediate male relatives sharing similar geographic spread. But even that possibility reinforced the same conclusion. The Mongol imperial house, through both deliberate polygyny and the privileges of conquest, reshaped the genetics of half a continent. Whether it was Genghis himself or his sons acting as multipliers, the empire's reproductive system functioned as an evolutionary accelerator. Within a few generations, the result was indistinguishable. a starburst of DNA so vast that today 1 in every 200 men on Earth belongs to that chromosomal constellation. The discovery reframed empire has not only social or military expansion, but reproductive saturation. It forced historians to confront uncomfortable arithmetic. War creates mortality, but also opportunity. By killing rival males and absorbing women and children into their clans, conquerors reset the demographic balance. They prune and pollinate simultaneously. The Mongols institutionalized this dynamic. While millions died, a single paternal line multiplied far beyond natural expectation. Evolution tends to reward whatever works, indifferent to ethics. On a graph of population genetics, morality has no meaning, only mutation rates. Yet for storytellers, the ethical dimension is unavoidable. The realization that the same violence that erased generations also ensured the persistence of one man's genome. The deeper scientists examined the pattern, the more it unveiled the hidden logic of history itself. Cities fall quickly, but DNA carries rebellion in its quiet endurance. The legacy of Genghis Khan proved that legacy requires hosts, not monuments. His empire of conquest was finite, his genetic empire still expanding invisibly with each birth. In the fluorescence of laboratory slides, the ancient steppe flickered again, a map glowing not with torches but with lives, each a molecule of memory. As the original research circulated, historians, anthropologists, and even philosophers began to argue about what it truly meant. A few pointed out that humanity had experienced founder events before: plains chieftains, Celtic warlords, ancient pharaohs, all left recognizable genetic shadows. Yet none compared to this magnitude. Most prolific patriarchs generated a diaspora of thousands, not tens of millions. The C3C cluster dwarfed them all. If the figures were correct, Genghis Khan's Y chromosome had spread faster than any known human trait except language. The question of why that happened sits at the crossroads of science and sociology. Genetics alone cannot explain the pattern. History provides the engine. Genghis Khan didn't just rule a vast population. He rewired its reproductive codes through systemic polygyny, inheritance laws, and patronage. His royal sons and grandsons enjoyed similar privileges, controlling administrations across 3 continents. Each commanded personal courts filled with wives and concubines, drawn from allied and defeated dynasties. Over successive generations, that arrangement became self-replicating. Where medieval Europe preserved bloodlines by forbidding bastardy, the Mongols extended theirs by institutionalizing it. Some anthropologists refer to this phenomenon as social selection, the way culture itself alters biological evolution. Under steppe politics, power earned access to reproduction. Reproduction reaffirmed power. This created a positive feedback loop. Loyalty was rewarded with land and wives, and their children inherited status, ensuring that the group's dominant genes persisted. It's the sociological equivalent of artificial selection, except the breeders were empires, not farmers. The Mongol period simply provided the perfect conditions for the effect to scale globally. Mobility, conquest, and a ruler determined to populate as widely as he ruled. In 2005, follow-up studies tested additional markers to refine the dates. Their conclusions tightened the timeline even further. The founder had lived between 1150 and 1220 CE, squarely the lifespan of Genghis Khan. The numbers aligned too neatly to ignore. A later 2015 study of nearly 90 populations confirmed that the lineage's diversity pattern, fitted a demographic explosion beginning 8 centuries earlier. When visualized through genetic migration software, the simulation resembled a spreading ring of fire, the same shape as the Mongol expansion map turned inside out. Empirical coincidence had become historical consensus. Still, a few dissenters held fast. Could a sampling bias exaggerate the correlation? Could retained Mongol nobility, long after the empire's fall, have continued multiplying independently of the original patriarch? Both points were valid, but statistically insufficient. Even if later Khans kept the lineage alive, they themselves came from his sons. Every link circled back to the same initial genome. The Mongol male line had no true outside adopter, because the imperial structure prevented unrelated men from claiming descent illegitimately. The bloodlines were both exclusive and everywhere. In museums and popular science exhibitions today, interactive maps visualize this phenomenon. Viewers tap regions and see tiny lights bloom along Eurasia, yellow dots glowing from Kazakhstan through Mongolia into northern China, smaller constellations over Iran and among Siberian tribes. The pattern looks eerily like the surface of a nervous system, neurons firing in response to stimuli that ended 8 centuries ago. Each point represents thousands of living men whose cells still carry that ancient template. It is the closest science has come to watching history breathe. The implications transcend curiosity. The Genghis Khan effect forced scholarship to re-evaluate how culture accelerates genetics. It revealed that evolution does not always proceed by environmental struggle, but can leap via social structure. Law, war, religion, and sexuality function as selective pressures as real as famine or climate. The same empire that standardized weights, trade routes, and written characters inadvertently standardized fragments of the human genome. Every son born below the same banners became part of an inheritance that ignored nationality. Yet admiration quickly mutates into unease. The idea that one man's success in mating could alter the species challenges our ethics of equality. Some commentators described it as biological tyranny, a reminder that natural law still privileges reproduction over justice. The moral paradox echoes the historical one. The hand that unified half the world also extinguished countless bloodlines to sustain its own. From the perspective of DNA, there is no villainy and no virtue, only propagation. But humans read more than molecules. We read meaning. In that gap between evolution's indifference and morality's anguish lies the true mystery of Genghis Khan. Picture the final image, a dark world map projected on laboratory glass. Slowly, points of amber light pulse across the continents, connecting in veins radiating outward from a single luminous core near the Mongolian highlands. The narrator's voice lowers. 8 centuries ago, a rider crossed these plains and called the world his family. Today, the world answers him in blood. The lights swell until the entire hemisphere glows, then fade into the silhouette of a single cell dividing, one lineage splitting again and again, unstoppable. That glowing atlas is the ultimate monument to empire, not built of marble or memory, but of chromosomes continuing their quiet march through generations. Borders vanish, languages die, but the pulse inside each microscopic strand endures. 16 million flashes across continents remind us that conquest has many afterlives, some loud with battle, some silent within our veins. In the end, Genghis Khan's greatest victory is not over nations, but over time itself, achieved through the simplest command written in every living thing: multiply. When the final smoke of Genghis Khan's campaigns drifted into the sky, the empire he left behind spanned 3 oceans, and divided the known world into before and after. Yet the man who had once united 1,000 quarreling tribes knew that armies alone could not hold it together. Empire dies fastest when blood runs shallow. His solution had always been lineage, the extension of conquest through kinship. In his last will, Genghis Khan ordered the division of territories among his 4 principal sons, Yoki, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui, each entrusted with a slice of the earth and with the duty to multiply upon it. Political dominion became biological inheritance. It was a perilous experiment in continuity. 4 temperaments bred from the same will but born to different mothers, each carrying the ambition of the father and the rivalry of brothers. Among them, Jochi, the eldest, was the most complicated thread. His paternity had been questioned for decades. He was conceived soon after Berta's abduction by a rival clan. Genghis Khan, refusing endless whisper, publicly declared him legitimate, saying, "He who doubts my son doubts me." Yet that shadow never fully lifted. The anxiety of uncertain birth would one day shape the geography of empires. Chagatai, second son, embodied order and discipline, unyielding, sharp-tongued, the self-appointed guardian of law. He distrusted Yoki's independence and argued endlessly over lines of succession. Ogedei III, polite and indulgent, became the father's favorite precisely because he relished duty without resentment. Tolui, the youngest, mirrored the Khan's temperament. Bold in war, reckless in feast, adored by soldiers. Between them lay both the empire's strength and its fault line. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the news was hidden for months to prevent rebellion. Only after final victories in northwest China did the generals announce his passing, accompanied by rituals of secrecy. Legends say the cortege slaughtered anyone who saw the funeral procession so that no witness could mark the grave. The myth of invisibility suited his purpose. He vanished from earth but multiplied in men. 2 years later, a great Kurultai met on the Orkhon River plains to choose his heir. After long debate, anchored more in politics than affection, Ogedei was proclaimed Great Khan. He was the glue meant to keep brothers from rupture. The transition was smooth only in appearance. Beneath the lavish coronation feasts ran fresh conspiracies. Jochi had died before his father, and his sons, Batu and Orda, now ruled the western steppes bordering the Volga. Chagatai retained his region in Central Asia. Tolui remained regent until Ogedei's formal enthronement. It resembled celestial mechanics, 4 orbits circling one absent sun. Each brother governed lands as if holding a piece of the Khan spirit. Together they radiated a collective gravitational field that kept the empire intact, at least for one more generation. Ogedei's rule between 1229 and 1241 marked the Mongol Empire's high tide. He rebuilt Karakorum into a permanent capital, anchoring the nomads to a physical heart. Caravans from Persia, China, and Russia crowded its markets, bringing spices, paper, silver, and fur. The steady influx of artisans, Persian stonecutters, Chinese architects, Muslim engineers, turned the once temporary encampment into a glittering city of mixed tongues. Yet Ogedei's ambition remained expansion. From his throne wrapped in sable, he ordered massive new campaigns westward into Europe and south into the Song dynasty's China. The western offensive became legend. Commanded by Batu, Jochi's ambitious son, and supported by veteran generals Subutai and Kadan, the Mongol armies thundered across the steppes of Russia like seasonal storms that refused to end. Cities such as Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev fell one after another. Chroniclers in frightened monasteries described arrows darkening skies, the earth quaking beneath hooves. In 1241, the invaders reached Hungary and Poland, driving knights and peasants alike before them. Then, just as Europe prepared for extinction, a messenger galloped into the camp. Ögedei Khan was dead. According to steppe tradition, all princes must return to elect the next ruler. Word spread through the armies like lightning. They turned around mid-victory. Europe was spared not by strength, but by mortality and ritual. That single heartbeat of human frailty checked the greatest military momentum on record. Across deserts, the generals galloped eastward, yet political unity began to crack along fraternal seams. Tolui's widow, the formidable Sorghaghtani Beki, wielded cunning unmatched by any man. Fluent in multiple languages and backed by her sons, Monke Kublai Hulagu, she saw succession as chess played with blood. While Chagatai claimed he should rule as senior brother, Sorghaghtani's diplomacy outmaneuvered him. At the 1251 Kurultai, her eldest Monke ascended as Great Khan, endorsed by both Mongol aristocrats and Chinese administrators. Through her, the empire slipped quietly back into Tolui's branch, while keeping pretense of unity. Marriage politics continued to weave the geography of inheritance into a living net. Mongol princesses married into royal houses of Persia, Armenia, and Korea. Sons of defeated rulers were paired with daughters of the Khan to guarantee submission. Some unions were tender, most strategic. The Silk Road that had once carried paper and perfume now trafficked in bloodlines. A princess's hand could secure a border better than 10,000 spears. When Monke's brother Hulagu marched into Persia to establish the Ilkhanate, he brought with him engineers and astrologers, but also a household filled with noble wives representing every corner of conquered Asia. The result was not only governance, but fusion. Empires that once identified themselves through religion or color now shared children. In China, Kublai Khan applied the same logic. He redefined conquest as absorption, marrying both Mongol and Chinese princesses, learning the Confucian classics and employing scholars as ministers. In 1271, he founded the Yuan dynasty, declaring himself son of heaven. His capital, Kanbalik, modern Beijing, blended Chinese architecture with steppe grandeur, its avenues wide enough for horsemen to parade beside mandarins. Through him, the blood of the steppe seated itself upon the dragon throne. Further west, Batu Khan cemented his dominion on the Volga plain. His domain, later called the Golden Horde, stretched from the Ural Mountains to the edges of Eastern Europe. From a distance it appeared a continuation of Genghis Khan's mission. Up close it was evolution. Batu's court adopted Islam for administration, but maintained the Yasa for justice. Moscow paid tribute in furs. Caravans from the Caspian passed unhindered. Though separated by thousands of kilometers, the descendants of the Great Khan moved in coordination, like organs of one vast animal living across 3 continents. Each kingdom was an echo of the original empire, yet carried distinct temperament. The Ilkhanate blended Persian sophistication. The Yuan became hybrid of nomad order and Chinese bureaucracy. The Golden Horde straddled between Asiatic steppe and Slavic forest. Messages carried by relays crossed deserts within weeks. Wedding gifts followed seasons' trade. The dynasty was no longer a family. It was a geography of kinship. As generations multiplied, legitimacy itself became hereditary proof. To be of the Golden Line held more authority than coin or sword. Genealogy became bureaucracy. Clerks meticulously recorded family trees in scrolls, as binding as treaties. Marriage proposals were vetted through this living archive to ensure the purity of the imperial seed. Nobles across Asia boasted partial descent to secure preference. Titles like closest in blood to the Great Khan replaced entire political parties. The afterlife of reproduction had become government procedure, but within that grandeur grew poison. Blood may unite, yet it also divides when measured too closely. Rival cousins accused each other of falsifying descent. Family councils turned into trials. The same system that had built empire now consumed it with bookkeeping of purity. In the next centuries, wars of brothers would eclipse wars of nation, proving again that the mightiest force on earth remains the oldest and frailest, family. As decades passed and the Mongol world stretched from the Danube to the Pacific, the memory of Genghis Khan solidified into something between religion and bureaucracy. Every decree opened with his name. Every coronation recycled the ritual of raising the new ruler on white felt beneath the open sky. To claim his blood was to borrow his authority, and genealogy became the empire's most valuable currency. Temples guarded scrolls of lineage as faithfully as relics. In courts across continents, clerks recited descent lines like liturgy, proof that a ruler carried the heaven-sent blood. This obsession with ancestry created an empire governed as much by statisticians as by soldiers. For each branch of the family, there existed archivists tracking births, deaths, and marriages with numerical precision. Genealogy determined rank. Even distant kin could claim wealth and jurisdiction through documented descent. In effect, reproduction had become bureaucratized. Lives once measured in battles were now measured in sons. Without heirs, authority evaporated. Adoption, too, had its rituals. A child absorbed into the line received new ancestry by decree, demonstrating that blood was not merely biological, but administrative. In Persia, Hulagu Khan's Ilkhanate expanded Mongol influence into the Islamic world. Yet under his descendants, the empire gradually converted to Islam. Here the family web adapted again. Genghis Khan's lineage began producing caliphs instead of khans, bridging nomadic and clerical legitimacy. Mosques rose beside step-style palaces. The imams quoted both the Quran and the Yasa. Mongol blood now pulsed within the faith that once viewed them as scourge. Marriages wove further complications. Hulagu's wives came from Turkish, Georgian, and Khorasani nobility, uniting lineages that centuries of holy war had kept apart. Their children grew fluent in multiple alphabets, their faces blending Mongol cheekbones with Persian eyes. The Conqueror's genome had learned diplomacy. Farther east in China, Kublai Khan steered his realm toward imperial form, more familiar to historians. He adopted the trappings of Chinese bureaucracy with enthusiasm: ministries, civil service exams, elaborate palace hierarchies. But the core remained steppe pragmatism. Decisions circled the family. Brothers, nephews, and in-laws ruled provinces. Princesses managed tax bureaus or diplomatic courts. The Yuan dynasty's unwritten constitution wasn't ideology. It was shared descent. Where earlier dynasties worshipped ancestors to glorify the dead, the Mongols worshipped ancestry to control the living. Diplomacy functioned through marriage contracts rather than treaties. When the Mongol envoy first reached the court of Burma, the king received a proposal of union rather than alliance. In parts of Eastern Europe, women of Mongol descent married Slavic princes, founding hybrid dynasties that would later govern medieval Russia. In Persia, the descendants of Hulagu married into indigenous Iranian houses of scholarship. their salons humming with debates between Buddhist monks, Muslim theologians, and Confucian scholars. The great Khan's genes no longer marched behind banners. They strolled through academies. Yet for all the civilization's polish, its foundation was unstable. Each Khanate inherited both the power and rivalry of siblings. The Golden Horde quarreled with the Ilkhanate over trade and taxation. The Yuan dynasty, looking down on nomadic cousins, claimed celestial superiority. Letters of accusation flew faster than caravans, one Khan calling another oppressor, tyrant, false heir. Beneath the diplomatic language simmered perennial anxiety. Who among them truly bore the uncorrupted seed? Every palace held portraits tracing lineage back to Genghis Khan, each drawn slightly differently, as if one face could authorize every ambition. Internal intrigue soon replaced external conquest. When a ruler died, widows and mothers maneuvered for succession. Poisoned cups, whispered alliances, and child Khans raised as puppets became the empire's second-generation politics. In Karakoram, rival councils debated interpretation of the Yasa, wielding its articles the way priests wield commandments. Dissenters invoked continuity, claiming their rebellion honored the founders' principles. Genghis Khan had used blood to unify. His heirs now used blood to divide. Despite this slow fragmentation, the empire's infrastructure refused to collapse. Trade routes continued humming, protected by residual respect for the family name. A merchant wearing the Khan's travel pass could cross 3 kingdoms unharmed, a degree of safety unmatched until modern passports. Science and art thrived in the spaces war had momentarily silenced. Persian astronomers served Chinese emperors. Venetian traders carried Central Asian innovations back to Europe. Paper money, printing, and medical textbooks spread along arteries of Mongol administration. The family's physical empire faded slower than its political unity. Like a heart still beating after the mind has died, the genealogical impulse persisted, however. In towns along the Volga, storytellers recited sagas of the Blue Wolf's children, tracing heroic ancestors back to an almost mythical steppe couple, the wolf and the doe, said to have birthed the Mongols. In China, the legend localized. The Yuan emperors portrayed Genghis as semi-divine, the bridge between heaven's mandate and the commoner's struggle. In Persia, poets recast him as philosopher king who destroyed idols so truth could breathe. Each culture molded the patriarch to its needs, rewriting ancestry as national myth, and still bodies defined borders. When the Ilkhanate faltered in the 14th century, claims of descent justified successive rulers even among those with the faintest trace of Mongol Y chromosome. To be of the house of Genghis conferred right to rule Afghanistan, Samarkand, or Crimea. Fact mattered less than persuasion. A few generations of intermarriage blurred authenticity beyond measure, but legitimacy thrived on belief, not certainty. If one could convincingly name an ancestor, the world defaulted to obedience. By the late medieval period, this belief produced consequences even its founder might have admired. Timur the Lame, architect of a later empire based in Samarkand, traced his lineage to convince allies to a lesser branch of the Khan's family, though evidence was scarce. Nonetheless, the claim worked. The aura of Genghis Khan had outlived genealogy. It had become genetic myth, a kind of inherited charisma that crossed boundaries long after the empire fractured. The family's reach mirrored that of its founders' campaigns, but with different weapons. Instead of swords, letters carried their will. Instead of cavalry, marriages. Generations rose and vanished, yet all bowed to the same ancestral story. Somewhere in the steppes wind, the echo of hooves blended with the laughter of children born in palaces that once worshipped those hooves. The empire had changed shape, from empire of conquest to empire of kinship, and both rested on the same foundation, the fragile continuity of flesh and name. By the time centuries blurred the outlines of borders, the dynasty's branches reached so wide that no one could trace every leaf. Princes of mixed ancestry governed cities whose founders had once trembled before their forebear. Mongol blood ran quietly through Persian sultans, Chinese emperors, and Russian dukes, each invoking the ancient name when it suited them and burying it when it did not. The thunder of hooves had faded to the murmur of courts, yet its rhythm persisted in protocol, ceremony, and lineage. Each signature on royal decrees, each blessing whispered over a newborn heir, repeated the same forgotten command: continue. Yet within that endless continuation lay the empire's most human moment, the realization that every greatness depends upon ordinary biology. Even Genghis Khan's divine lineage survived only through breath, milk, and lullabies. Kingdoms might rise from ambition, but they are sustained by the simplest acts of the living: women enduring childbirth, children crying inside palaces, love occurring between strangers chosen by law. Beneath the politics and battles, the family remained the quiet engine of history. And so, long after banners rotted and capitals turned to dust, the night wind crossing Mongolia still carried two sounds that built an empire and preserved its bloodline: the echo of hooves and the cry of a child. Every empire leaves two histories, the one written in chronicles of banners raised and heroes crowned, and another inscribed in human bodies, the record of who lived, who died, and who replaced the dead. For all the admiration surrounding Genghis Khan's ingenuity, nothing can veil the arithmetic that built his dominion. The same logistics that organized grain and armor also organized annihilation. Cities fed his armies even as cities starved them. Captives provided labor and wives in equal measure. Progress marched alongside massacre, its rhythm measured not in triumphal drums but in heartbeats silenced. The Mongol expansion erased millions. Contemporary accounts struggled to quantify the cost because the destruction was mathematical. Anywhere resistance persisted, populations vanished. Persian historians recalled entire provinces left without the bark of a dog or the cry of a rooster. Chinese records tell of towns turned to ash, where surviving artisans were numbered like livestock and redistributed across Asia. Even sympathetic chroniclers, indebted to Mongol patronage, wrote with horror of walls built from stacked bones. The empire furnished safety for traders, yes, but only after clearing every obstacle to the horizon. Violence was neither random nor impulsive. It was policy engineered for speed, for rewriting demography as quickly as territory. In his code of law, the Yasa, Genghis Khan outlawed feuds among soldiers, yet sanctioned extinction for rebellion among civilians. The message was consistent: mercy guaranteed peace, resistance guaranteed erasure. The strategy worked because it appealed to a primal calculus within human nature. Fear travels faster than forgiveness. Each conquered city taught the next to surrender. This efficiency of terror is what made his empire possible, and what ensured the genetic phenomenon that followed. To modern eyes, it seems a contradiction that slaughter and fertility can coexist. Yet anthropology reveals they are linked by the logic of domination. Across civilizations, victorious males often claimed the women of defeated enemies, partly as trophy, partly as integration. It is a gruesome continuity, older than writing. From Bronze Age tribes to Roman legions, from Viking raids to colonial frontiers, power has always been expressed through the control of reproduction. The conqueror's right over the conquered body is the oldest technology of empire. When men died in war and women were absorbed by victors, entire genetic landscapes were remade within a generation. Thus, violence became biology masked as destiny. In the Mongol case, scale magnified pattern beyond precedent. Each campaign selectively eliminated rival male lines while preserving female populations to sustain the victors. Surviving women entered new households. Their children carried the conqueror's name. Anthropologists studying similar events describe this recomposition of ancestry as genetic sweep, a phenomenon in which one Y chromosome replaces many. Empires may collapse under rebellion, but genes endure quietly, stubbornly, indifferent to morality. In every cell where a Mongol code persists today lie untold stories of coercion and survival intertwined. History seldom counts the enslaved in chapters of success, yet without them, no kingdom survives. Mongol slavery differed from European chattel in structure, but not in cruelty. Captured artisans were traded across borders for siege technology. Girls were given as gifts to secure alliances. Children grew up never knowing if they were spoils or citizens. Paradoxically, this same moving population became the connective tissue of globalization, an unwilling network that transferred craftsmanship, language, food, and DNA from one edge of the continent to another. Even through abuse, humanity finds ways to merge. Consider Nishapur, a Persian city whose destruction became legend. After a Mongol commander was killed in battle, the Khan's daughter demanded retribution, equivalent to every drop of his lost blood. The result was a massacre so thorough that chroniclers could scarcely believe it. Years later, however, migrants from surrounding villages repopulated the valley under Mongol administration. The new inhabitants intermarried with soldiers, rebuilt streets, reopened markets. Within 2 generations, the city's culture thrived again, but its population was genetically different. What appeared as resilience was, in biological terms, replacement. The memory of those killed lived only through those who replaced them, and the conqueror's seed thrived amid the ruins it had made. This brutal cycle, death making space for new life, is not unique to Mongolia. In Ireland, a millennium earlier, Niall of the 9 Hostages, legendary progenitor of the Uí Néill dynasty, established a similar genetic empire. Modern DNA studies reveal his Y chromosome, among roughly 1 in 12 Irishmen today, concentrated near Ulster and western Scotland. His story too mixes charisma with coercion, war, hostage-taking, selective marriage. Like the Mongols, the Irish expansion blended sword and seduction until heritage became the same thing as conquest. Across cultures that never met, humanity has obeyed one unsentimental rule: power writes itself in flesh. Yet anthropology also shows where that rule falters. Some conquerors destroy but fail to seed. Diseases, infertility, or dynastic collapse erase their traces. Others, like the Mongols, couple aggression with organization, turning dominance into a reproductive system. The difference lies not in moral character, but in societal structure. How warfare and family intersect. The Mongol hierarchy rewarded fecundity as virtue. Every son born to a loyal warrior was celebrated not privately but collectively. Inscriptions praise mothers who bore soldiers. Fertility became a civic duty and a weapon as sharp as any blade. Modern historians often struggle with sentences that combine admiration and horror. To acknowledge Genghis Khan's administrative brilliance risks excusing destruction. To condemn it risks ignoring the world he built from those ashes. The tension mirrors the human genome itself. Sections that carry disease also encode survival. The same empire that erased cities stabilized trade for centuries. The moral arithmetic refuses clarity. Each generation reading his story recalculates which column holds the greater value, order or blood. Through this lens, Genghis Khan's genetic legacy becomes less miracle than equation. For every life terminated by war, another was absorbed through union. For every lineage erased, another expanded exponentially. Multiply that pattern across 20 years of continuous conquest, and the result approaches inevitability. The empire's biology was self-replicating long after its politics faded. But what does survival mean when built upon suffering? Does endurance make an act righteous or merely successful? These questions haunt every empire, yet few expose them as nakedly as the Mongols did. Their triumph stripped civilization to its primal gears, the will to live, mate, and replicate. The priests and poets who later celebrated the Mongols' tolerance and law seldom spoke of the unnamed women whose bodies became the parchment of that law, inscribed generation after generation without consent. In the arithmetic of conquest, they are the numbers unseen, the remainders carrying history's burden. And still, without them, the story cannot exist. The DNA discovered in 21st century laboratories is not merely Genghis Khan's victory. It is theirs too in coded protest turned inheritance. Their involuntary endurance ensured that the Conqueror's legacy would not vanish with his reign. Biology, it seems, remembers everyone even when history chooses not to. The records written by scribes trace kings. The data extracted by scientists whispers women's anonymous survival as quiet defiance under the empire of men. Across the centuries, scholars and storytellers have wrestled with this paradox. The same processes that erase lives also ensure remembrance through genes. In a strange calculus, the grave becomes a cradle. Whenever a conquering line prospers, it does so atop the silence of the defeated. The Mongols made that paradox planetary. Their conquests broke civilizations into sand, yet the winds scattered that sand into new soil. The result was a world both devastated and interconnected, ruins stitched together by roads and by blood. The steppe itself remembers none of this. Grass grows over burial mounds, cattle graze among forgotten cities. Only people attach meaning to what survival costs, and even then memory bends toward pride. Within a generation of Genghis Khan's death, Mongol descendants celebrated his victories as destiny fulfilled. Chroniclers working for his heirs purified the narrative. The massacres became divine judgment, the burned capitals corrupt, trees pruned for new growth. Empires have always rewritten their own arithmetic until loss equals renewal. History is humanity's way of forgiving success. But DNA does not forgive. It simply persists. Perhaps that is why the genetic signature of Genghis Khan unsettles modern minds more than medieval slaughter does. The bones of victims lie still beneath Eurasian soil, but their conquerors' chromosomes travel eternally, carried by people unaware of their heritage. The discovery of the C3Q lineage felt like revelation, because it forced a confrontation with what victory truly means. Empires fade into poetry, yet continue walking invisibly among us. Comparison with other genetic conquerors exposes how common the pattern is. In China, the Qing emperors of the Manchu Isin-Jioro clan left a distinctive Y chromosome that still marks millions in northern China today. In Ireland, The Uí nail tarried through centuries of isolation to leave a similar paternal signal. In Western Africa, lineages of medieval Sahelian kings trace comparable concentration, but none reshape human geography so globally as the Mongols. Their empire was not an event. It was an algorithm executed over generations, optimized for replication through privilege and infrastructure. While other dynasties guarded bloodlines behind palace walls, Mongols exported theirs by mail carrier, marriage, and war. Anthropologists argue that such patterns reflect the logic of patriarchy scaled to empire. When politics favors male inheritance, reproductive monopoly becomes state ideology. The seed of one man carries both glory and governance. We like to imagine civilization as progress, but its architecture has often simply provided better tools for the ancient impulse to dominate and reproduce. The Mongols were honest about it. Power justified fertility. Fertility justified power. Even when the empire fragmented, its remnants, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Yuan, sustained the creed that legitimate rulers must descend from the great Khan's blood. In that requirement lurked a sort of biological totalitarianism, a mandate to keep producing heirs until eternity confirmed what heaven had once decreed. From a modern vantage, this seems monstrous, yet pieces of that thinking survive everywhere. Monarchies still trace paternity to prove worth. Societies nurse obsessions with pure ancestry, with passing down names unbroken. We inherit the conquerors' myths daily, without calling them conquest. The genetics of empire expose how social ambition and biology remain indistinguishable. Genghis Khan's code thrives because humanity still reveres permanence, still fears oblivion, and yet within that acknowledgement lies something human enough to forgive. For though domination breeds cruelty, the instinct to endure does not. The dreaming of continuity, the hope that some fragment of us survives, is shared by both conqueror and victim. Every newborn, whether child of power or poverty, carries that same defiant arithmetic to exist in spite of disappearance. In this sense, even the empire's victims achieved what the conqueror desired: persistence through offspring. The difference lies only in whose names history recorded. Ethnographers visiting Mongolia today note how memory drifts between guilt and pride. To the pastoral families riding the same plains, Genghis Khan is less historical villain than elemental ancestor, the one who proved survival's possibility in an unforgiving world. They honor his name in prayers before journeys, brand vodka with his portrait, teach school children his laws. To them, the empire's ancient brutality dissolves into metaphor for resilience. Build order from hunger, unity from loss. It is a moral alchemy in which destruction purifies rather than defiles. For the geneticist peering through microscopes, that symbolism condenses into an astonishing fact: that humanity's most violent centuries produced unprecedented connectivity. The Silk Road, reopened under Mongol rule, became pathway for art and medicine as well as armies. Trade stitched physical wounds almost as quickly as war reopened them. The same continuity that carried disease like the Black Death also carried language, ideas, and tolerance. Biology is blind to intent. It mixes what philosophy divides. Steppe blood flowing through Persian veins or Slavic bones testifies not to ideology, but to this brute fact of mingling. Out of horror grew diversity. From isolation, exchange. What then should be celebrated? The connection or the carnage? Can heritage built on destruction still teach survival? The question returns like a ghost each time history repeats itself. For in truth, All civilizations have grown through thresholds of suffering. The Mongol Empire was only grander, swifter, and more statistically visible. Every world we inhabit rests upon remnants of another. Every family descends from both predator and prey. Our genomes tower like cathedrals constructed from bones we rarely name. As night falls again over the steppes, stars scatter above grasslands that once trembled beneath hooves. To the wind there is no morality, only motion. But to the thinking species that inherited the wind's persistence, meaning remains unavoidable. Perhaps that is the Empire's final legacy. Not pride in lineage nor guilt in conquest, but awareness that survival itself carries ethical weight. We live because others died. We endure because someone conquered. Acknowledging that truth neither glorifies nor condemns, it reconciles. So the dark arithmetic completes its equation. Death and life balanced forever on the scale of inheritance. The empire that began in vengeance ends in revelation that within the DNA of millions cruelty and continuity coexist, inseparable as night from dawn. And when we whisper the name of Genghis Khan, we speak not of a man but of the species' oldest story repeated in our own cells, that even destruction, in its terrible way, remembers to preserve. It began as a whisper within numbers, a pattern repeating itself across laboratories from London to Ulan, Bata. When geneticists first mapped the star cluster haplotype, they had only fragments of evidence, isolated samples from populations straddling Asia's spine. 2 decades later, with whole genome sequencing and computational modeling, the picture sharpened into revelation. Haplogroup C2, the label that scientists give the Y chromosome lineage associated with Genghis Khan, stretched across 8 time zones and hundreds of ethnic identities. Bayesian algorithms confirmed what the early 2000s data had suggested. A sudden population expansion, roughly 8 centuries ago, radiating outward from the Mongolian plateau in waves that mirrored caravan routes and imperial patrol paths. The modern study of human history no longer rests only on ruins or scrolls. High-throughput sequences replace shovels. Databases replace libraries. Each strand of DNA serves as a fossil encoded in molecules rather than stone. When the project called the Genographic Atlas released interactive maps of global ancestry, one hemisphere glowed with evidence of a single event, the Mongol expansion. What had once been chronicled as geopolitical saga now appeared as a biological weather pattern, spreading like a pulse through time. Lines of descent followed the same arteries that carried silk, spices, and gunpowder. The ghost of the empire traveled the same roads as its merchants. In university halls, scientists now describe the phenomenon with clinical poetry. The lineage, they say, exhibits serial founder diffusion, a domino effect of reproduction aligned with conquest and trade. The data can be simulated on computers like a time-lapse animation. Start with a small cluster of ancestral genomes circling the Onon River around 1200 CE, advance the timeline, and the cluster expands through China, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, then into Russia and parts of Eastern Europe. You can watch the empire grow in seconds, a living topographic map glowing in phosphorescent reds. For Mongolian historians, the visualization is both proof and parable. This is our history breathing, says Dr. Erdine, archivist at Ulaanbaatar's National Museum. He gestures toward an image of spiraling light projected across a digital globe. It shows that the steppe was never an emptiness. It was a heart. His words balance pride with hesitation. For centuries, Western accounts portrayed the Mongols as nomadic storms, destruction incarnate. Now those same foreigners draw maps where Mongolian ancestry forms half a continent's skeleton. Recognition feels long overdue, yet uncomfortably complete. Local media occasionally turn that science into self-mythology. Newspapers print headlines like, "Are you descended from the Khan?" Genetic testing companies advertise kits promising to trace customers to the legendary lineage. Requests surge every spring around the anniversary of Genghis Khan's birth. For older Mongolians who grew up during socialist rule, when reverence for feudal ancestors was forbidden, the new genetic narrative restores identity. "He's in our blood, literally," one farmer tells an interviewer. "To carry his line is to carry proof that we belong." Yet for others, the notion carries darker undertones. The same discovery that inspires pride also recalls conquest remembered by neighbors in trauma. In Uzbekistan, a teacher interviewed for a documentary describes conflicting feelings. "If my ancestors were spared, they lived because of obedience, not free will. And I might share that heritage. Should I celebrate survival if it means submission?" Genetic data, she says, reminds you that history never forgets consent. Ethicists weigh into such debates with caution. Professor Kwame Rowland of the University of Toronto compares the search for famous ancestors to a new form of spiritual colonialism. "We love neat origins," he explains during a conference on population genomics. "They give chaos a narrative. But DNA is not a moral trophy. It's geography that learned to reproduce." He reminds audiences that one person's lineage's success often mirrors another's erasure. Every spike on the haplogroup C2 frequency map has a shadow of frequencies extinguished. Despite those warnings, fascination grows. With genome sequencing costs shrinking, regional surveys now include peripheral areas once unreachable. Tibetan monasteries, Siberian fishing villages, remote oases along the Pamir. Everywhere the pattern lingers, faint but detectable, a breadcrumb trail of chromosomes following the empire's path. Some regions retain fragments of earlier local lineages, forming mosaic intersections where Mongol ancestry mixed with others. Scientists can even estimate how many generations back the blend occurred. In men from northern China, the shared ancestor lies roughly 32 generations ago. In western Kazakhstan, about 35. In Russia's Volga Basin, 40. Time collapses into math. Men alive today carry in each cell a record of every migration their forefathers rode. Genomic technology adds artistry to this revelation. By translating statistical frequencies into color gradients, cartographers render living maps of memory, Asia glowing like a lantern lit from within. The highest intensities cluster in Mongolia and inner China, fading in concentric halos into the Middle East, then blinking again in obscure pockets far west along ancient trade arcs. Each dot flickering across the map represents thousands of stories never told in archives. A soldier settling in a new land, a captured artisan marrying her captor, a merchant forming family far from home. Geneticists narrate these maps with awe. Historians see them as ghost atlases, the empire's second life drawn in flesh and probability. The work also challenges the boundary between scientific detachment and emotional meaning. When field teams collect samples in Mongolia, they describe a ritual atmosphere. Participants often touch the cotton swabs as if they were sacred instruments. Many hum short prayers for their ancestors before offering consent. To give DNA is to give history a voice, they say. Researchers reciprocate with reverence. One recalls riding for hours through winter fields to reach elderly nomads willing to participate. We took only saliva, she explains, but they treated the gesture like confession. They wanted the world to know they existed. For those scientists, the most astonishing realization came not from past discoveries, but from what the data predicted, the living continuity of migration. Even after the empire's collapse, trade routes it established guided genetic flow for centuries. Traveling Mongol postal riders had unwittingly become pollinators, distributing heritage slowly but persistently. Over time, warfare faded, caravans replaced armies, and intermarriage among traders perpetuated the pattern. The genetic footprint proved that culture can evolve into its opposite, aggression melting into exchange. Inside laboratories, graduate students compare ancient skull DNA to modern samples using software that turns numbers into sound frequencies. Each tested genome hums a distinct note. Together they form chords. When played sequentially, Genghis Khan's star cluster sings a resonance all its own, a deep tone repeating across data sets like a heartbeat that refuses silence. Standing inside that digital hum, one realizes how intimate the connection between science and myth has become. We no longer need temples to reach transcendence. A sequencer hums it into existence. Yet every discovery encourages new humility. No model perfectly explains the randomness of legacy. Disease, environment, and chance share influence with conquest. Scientists acknowledge uncertainty through error bars, stretching like ripples along graphs. What fascinates me, says population analyst Leila Chen, is that randomness itself becomes pattern. War, migration, love, all chaos given enough generations begins to look mathematical. So the search to map Genghis Khan's genetic echo feels less like forensic discovery and more like meditation. Each sequence analyzed is a dialogue between event and eternity, between chaos and order. Humanity examines its own code and sees reflection, ambition magnified by survival. The old question, how one man could father millions, has expanded into new wonder, how every action, violent or tender, travels endlessly through time disguised as biology. The deeper geneticists look, the more revelation blurs with philosophy. A strand of DNA is only a chemical structure, adenine, cytosine, thymine, guanine. But read through human curiosity, it becomes scripture. Every sequencing run transforms molecules into meaning. In modern Mongolian universities, students now grow up studying both their ancestors' chronicles and their ancestors' chromosomes. Science and story have merged. The steppes that once produced warriors now produce geneticists mapping the same horizons their forefathers crossed. In a laboratory outside Ulaanbaatar, a researcher named Sarul arranges samples with monastic precision. Her test subjects include farmers, camel herders, and taxi drivers, each indifferent to science, but proud of what the data might affirm. When she feeds the sequences into a server, a cascade of colored graphs fills the screen. What strikes me most, she says, is not how similar people are to the Khan, but how similar they are to each other. The line that unites 15 million men also connects billions more through overlaps, barely visible unless magnified by computation. The difference between conqueror and conquered blurs into shared code. In London and Tokyo, similar teams refine Bayesian algorithms to back-calculate population expansion. The models pulse on screens like breathing organisms. Parameters adjust for mutation rates, generation intervals, historical census data. When optimized, every simulation stabilizes around one epoch, the early 13th century. The genetic curve spikes sharply, reflecting sudden male line proliferation before tapering into modern balance. Science has no poetry, but the shape resembles an echo, one overwhelming shout fading into silence yet never disappearing. To visualize it globally, data scientists rendered a 3D animation for a museum exhibition called Empires Within. Visitors stand before a dim sphere representing Earth. As centuries pass in minutes, dots of light flash outward from Mongolia, tracing trade routes like veins. The Silk Road glows first, then the Volga Basin, then Persia and the northern plains. When the animation ends, the lights scatter, dim but everywhere. A narrator murmurs that the empire fell. The lineage did not. Audiences often stand quietly afterward, unsure whether to applaud or mourn. Ethical debates shadow the fascination. At conferences, questions surface like small rebellions. Should scientific findings about ancestry celebrate domination? Does amplifying a conqueror's biology risk glorifying violence? Geneticist Erasmo Velasquez answers with uneasy honesty, "We don't celebrate. We illuminate." DNA doesn't praise or condemn, it just remembers. The difficulty, he says, lies in the human impulse to translate remembrance into pride. In international panels, Mongolian historians counter that remembrance can also mean ownership. For centuries, writes scholar Byambajav Tsogu, the world measured us by destruction. Now it measures us by inheritance. We cannot change how our ancestors lived, but we can decide how their story enlightens rather than terrifies. His words echo a national effort to balance myth with accountability. Museums present Genghis Khan not only as conqueror, but as lawgiver and unifier. Genetics offers them factual foundation for belonging, even as the moral complexities remain unresolved. For individuals carrying the haplogroup, reactions vary from indifference to existential shock. Some feel invisible kinship with strangers half a world away. Others reject the connection entirely. A medical technician in Seoul, learning of his genetic link, shrugs. "Everyone descends from someone," he says. "This one just rode a horse." In contrast, a teacher in Kyrgyzstan describes it differently. "It means my ancestors endured." That endurance matters. Between those statements lies the emotional spectrum of modern heritage, between science's indifference and humanity's yearning for significance. Computational genomics has also revealed subtler echoes, shared mutations in genes tied to adaptation, lactose tolerance, altitude resilience, appearing where Mongol herders once fractured isolation. In Central Asian nomadic groups, these traits are not mere remnants but advantages shaped by centuries of movement. Conquest reorganized metabolisms, explains physiologist Dr. Elena Pavlenko. The empire restructured bodies to fit its geography. The past lives not only in surnames, but in enzymes and lungs, silent souvenirs of expansion. Outside the laboratory, art interprets the science. Contemporary Mongolian painters craft portraits in which chromosomes weave through grassland landscapes, blue and gold strands turning into horse trails across canvas. Musicians compose symphonies inspired by genetic frequencies, turning chromosomes into rhythm, 4 notes recurring endlessly, mirroring DNA's base pairs. Public fascination has given the nation a new aesthetic of belonging, heritage as pattern, ancestry as design. And yet among neighboring populations, the same imagery provokes unease. In Kazakhstan, public murals celebrating Mongol DNA were defaced with graffiti reading, "Remember the graves." In parts of China, discussions of descent sparked nationalistic debates about ownership of history. The Invisible Empire continues to divide through identity politics, as it once divided through battlefields. Genetics, meant to unite through knowledge, often reminds humanity of how unity was achieved. When bioethicists speak about Genghis Khan, they use him less as individual and more as model, an experiment in how power amplifies itself biologically. Every leader who secures reproduction through privilege repeats his formula, whether in royal dynasties or modern fame. In that sense, his genome is planetary metaphor, evidence of how influence still seeks immortality through descendants, whether genetic, ideological, or technological. The Mongol Y chromosome is simply the oldest example of exponential reach. For philosophers, the story circles back to a haunting premise. If genes can remember geography, war, migration, even accident, then memory itself exists beneath consciousness. The planet's surface turns endlessly, but its code keeps the score. Within each human cell, history translates itself into survival instructions, erasing names but keeping adaptations. Refugees of the past become ancestors without knowing. Conquerors dissolve into statistics. The steppe winds that once carried armies now carry power lines, yet the continuity of energy feels the same, motion seeking permanence. So what survives? Not law, not architecture. What persists are small instructions: to breathe thinner air, to digest milk, to remember resilience. Genghis Khan's legacy thus transcends heroism or guilt. It becomes emblem of continuity. The steppe, once battlefield, is now laboratory. The skulls that terrified chroniclers have turned into data points fueling research that teaches empathy through understanding shared origin. As night falls over the modern grasslands, satellites trace orbits invisible but constant, just as the genetic echoes beneath them do. From those heights, Mongolia appears dark except for sparse clusters of light, resembling again the old genetic map, isolated, luminous, enduring. Somewhere below, a child looks up at the same sky and feels no burden of empires, only curiosity about stories inside his own flesh. Science whispers the answer softly. The stories were never gone. The empire simply changed scale, from borders of land to borders of chromosomes. And within those borders, history continues to grow like a living map of humanity, remembering itself. The empire of the living faded, yet his presence never left the earth. Even as his palaces of felt sank into mud and his capitals turned to dust, people spoke the name of Genghis Khan as though speaking of a star that never set. The man who once terrified continents became less a historical figure than an atmospheric force. Part ancestor, part archetype, lingering between god and ghost. Through legend, worship, and eventually commerce, he was reborn again and again. Every generation remade him to fit what it desired most: strength, unity, or simply explanation for its own survival. The metamorphosis began the moment he vanished. According to chronicles, when Genghis Khan died during his campaign against the kingdom of Shisia, his generals swore to keep the grave secret forever. His body, they said, was returned to Mongolia under guard by soldiers who killed every witness along the way. Some claimed 1,000 horses trampled over the burial site to erase it. Others that rivers were diverted to hide him beneath water. The absence was deliberate, a final act of control. No monument could equal mystery. A tomb can be desecrated, but an idea hidden in earth becomes eternal. For 8 centuries, that secrecy has nourished obsession. Archaeologists, adventurers, and mystics have scoured the steppe searching for the Emperor's resting place. They bring drones, magnetometers, satellite imaging, and still find nothing but rumor. Mongolians themselves view such quests with ambivalence, between pride and sacrilege. If the sky chose to hide him, humans should not interfere. A herder told one expedition team, "You cannot dig for faith, and yet curiosity endures. Each failure enlarges the myth. The missing body transforms into symbol of boundless rule. Even death could not capture him." Over time, myth fused with worship. In the 13th century, his heirs established shrines where captured banners represented his spirit. By the 16th, his name invoked divine protection during war. Some believed thunder was his laughter, others that the Milky Way was his journey path in the afterlife. As Mongolia transitioned through Buddhism and communism, he adapted, slipping through ideologies unharmed. The communists banned his veneration, but citizens on remote plateaus still whispered his name during storms, praying for guidance. When the Soviet Union collapsed, statues of Lenin fell, but the Khan rose again, literally in stone steel. And neon-modern Ulaanbaatar now bears his face everywhere. Airports, vodka labels, universities, entire highways. He is no longer simply a national hero. He is the nation's avatar. Tourists buy T-shirts displaying the Conqueror's silhouette in the stylization of pop icons. Children chant poems equating his destiny with the sun. Even global corporations use his name as shorthand for fearlessness. The image shifts from warrior to entrepreneur, from horse to helicopter. Proof that myth never dies. It only rebrands. When asked whether such commercialization desecrates a sacred figure, a museum curator smiles. "He destroyed worlds," she says. "A billboard will not offend him." At the same time his myth grew larger, our faith in science began rewriting the script. The 21st century offered a new immortality more precise than legend: DNA. Laboratories now function as cathedrals where believers in data encounter awe akin to religious revelation. Genghis Khan, once sanctified by pagans and monks, is resurrected digitally through sequences of code. His divinity now measured not in miracles, but in population statistics. To modern secular societies, the shared chromosome functions as relic. Its discovery invites pilgrimage in test tubes rather than temples. Philosophers of science note the irony. Our ancestors sought eternity in heaven, we seek it in heredity. Both rely on the same structure of belief, the conviction that essence survives somewhere, whether in afterlife or in nucleotides. The geneticists mapping the star cluster haplotype play roles once reserved for priests. They connect the living to invisible ancestry, offering redemption through knowledge. You are a child of the Khan. The data announces, and the result resonates like an oracle. The shift from myth to molecule hasn't erased superstition. It has modernized it. Meanwhile, archaeology's tangible search continues like a ritual of futility. Satellite images reveal promising mounds. Digs uncover burial complexes bursting with treasures, yet none conclusively his. Each failure becomes headline. The tomb remains silent. Rival projects debate methods. Should sacred sites be disturbed or left intact? The debate pits two spiritualities against each other. Reverence for the dead versus worship of discovery. Every excavation evokes the ancient fear that unearthing the conqueror might break a cosmic contract. In folk tales, disturbing his grave would unleash storms so fierce they would swallow the steppe. Scientists, of course, dismiss such warnings, yet subconsciously respect them. After each unfruitful season, they pause humbled. The mystery endures because it satisfies both science and faith. The missing tomb allows endless reinterpretation, a gap where imagination can breathe. For Mongolians, it grants their ancestor privacy denied to ordinary mortals. For foreigners, it keeps the adventure alive. In both cases, absence equates immortality. Death's proof withheld means death unrealized. He becomes Schrödinger's conqueror, both buried and eternal. The parallel with his genetic resurrection is uncanny. Just as archaeologists cannot pinpoint his body, scientists cannot reduce his lineage to a single sample. The C2 haplogroup marks millions, but none can claim with certainty to host the pure original. Each man stands simultaneously as proof and approximation. The emperor is everywhere and nowhere. The myth of omnipresence, once rooted in superstition, now has empirical echo in biology. If museums cannot display his corpse, humanity itself has become his exhibit. Between these twin pursuits, the tomb and the genome, stretches our civilization's own paradoxical hunger. We dig into the past not only for knowledge but for contact, reassurance that the extraordinary remains reachable. The archaeologist sifts dust for bones. The scientist sifts data for ancestry. Both chase the same phantom. The first seeks relic, the second relation. Neither accepts that history could vanish. Mongolian poets describe the Khan's immortality using a single word difficult to translate, Suld, meaning both spirit and banner. They believe each generation carries a fragment of his soul in their hearts. To them, his DNA findings are not revelation but confirmation, the sky's prophecy made visible. He lives in us, says Elder Batsuk, while tending sheep near the Kurlan River. Not in bone, not in blood only, but in direction. Wherever we move, he moves again. His statement encapsulates an older wisdom. Immortality is motion. Modern mythographers argue that such persistence reflects psychological need more than historical truth. Every culture canonizes its founders because mortality is unbearable without audience. Genghis Khan provides both legacy and lesson, proof that dominance fades while memory endures. He becomes the mirror through which humanity examines its own appetite for continuity. The more we learn about him scientifically, the more mythic he becomes, framed by the same question that followed him in life. How far can human will reach before turning divine? What gives myth its longevity is not accuracy, but adaptability. Each century edits the Khan to meet its own hunger. To medieval Persians, he was scourge of God. To 19th century romantics, a symbol of wild freedom. To modern Mongolia, the father of nationhood. The name changes accent, yet the silhouette remains. Even foreign powers that once demonized him have grafted fragments of his legend onto their own narratives. In Russia, he appears as warning against disunity. In China, as proof of empire's inclusivity. In the West, as raw fascination, the man who built a network that prefigured globalization. The myths function like languages borrowing from a shared root. The Great Khan as grammar for ambition. Tourists visiting Mongolia today find both shrine and souvenir. At the colossal statue rising from the plains east of Ulaanbaatar, guides recite facts half historical, half devotional. They explain that beneath the monument sits a museum housing artifacts. But what draws people isn't bronze or exhibit. It is the view. From the statue's crown, the steppe unrolls endlessly, a reminder of scale beyond comprehension. There visitors often fall silent, sensing what words cannot frame. The measure of one human will set against infinity. Some leave laughing, others praying, all participating unconsciously in ritual, the modern pilgrimage to a myth made flesh in steel. Meanwhile, scientists returning from conferences carry different relics. Datasets, algorithms, sample vials. Their pilgrimages happen in clean rooms where centrifuges replace wind. Yet in the sterile hum of machinery lives a kindred reverence. When a sequence aligns perfectly in digital readout, when a mutation matches prediction, researchers experience wonder older than religion, the awareness of connection. The tools may be new, the emotion ancient. The difference between priest blessing relic and scientist verifying sequence is vocabulary, not devotion. Ethically, both pursuits expose humanity's uneasy relationship with immortality. Religion promises it as reward. Science discovers it as consequence. Genghis Khan sought eternity through conquest, believing walls and bloodlines would defend his name. He failed in architecture, yet triumphed in anatomy. The armies vanished, but his cells survive, autonomous, multiplying silently beyond control. He became the proof of unintended salvation, a man who tried to dominate the world only to find immortality by dissolving into it. Philosophers draw from this a cautionary paradox. Every human act of preservation eventually transforms into something unrecognizable. The tomb hidden to protect him became metaphor. The DNA considered mundane now confers sacredness. Desire for permanence always creates its opposite, disappearance that ensures memory. In tracing his genome, we prove what his burial secrecy first declared, that to last forever one must be unfindable. This realization aligns with Mongolia's own spiritual worldview. The steppes' religions, old and new, see time not as line but as circle. To them, the Khan's story is seasonal. Conquest as summer, decay as winter, rebirth as spring. Even his genome fits this pattern. Cells dividing endlessly, renewing an ancient season inside the future. Modernity names it biology. Poets call it wind returning home. The deeper one contemplates that continuity, the quieter judgment becomes. To reduce Genghis Khan to murderer neglects his reformer's intellect. To deify him excuses cruelty. Yet beyond both verdicts lies something simpler, a meditation on survival. Civilization, like species, advances by continuity more than conscience. The Khan's lineage endures because life, indifferent to ethics, values persistence itself. His enduring myth shows that humanity, for all its moral machinery, still venerates endurance as the highest virtue. In the film of history, his figure plays both destroyer and architect, sinner and saint. Each era edits the ending differently, but the final frame remains the same. A lone rider dissolving into horizon, neither ascending nor falling, just moving forward. That motion is immortality, the same motion now unfolding invisibly within genome, within story, within memory. Centuries from now, when our monuments crumble and the languages that name him change once again, silent strands of his code will still ride through the bloodstream of strangers who will never read this history. They will wake, work, love, and die without realizing that a fragment of the old steppe wind breathes inside them. And in that unknowing continuity, Genghis Khan achieves what even conquering the world could not. He becomes the pulse that outlived intention, the eternal traveler carried in the arteries of mankind. 16 million men. That figure has been repeated so often that it risks sounding abstract, a statistic drained of breath. Yet behind those digits stand 16 million faces, beating hearts and lines of ancestry, twisting through deserts, forests, and cities that never saw the steppe. No single monument, no library of chronicles can contain the immensity of such continuity. When geneticists calculated that roughly 1 in every 200 men living today carries a Y chromosome traceable to Genghis Khan's line, they didn't just reveal a record, they described a conversation between centuries still occurring inside human bodies. It is easy to hear those numbers and imagine triumph, the ultimate proof of empire's success. But numbers are poor storytellers. They forget what they represent. 16 million descendants do not measure glory. They measure connection. They are evidence of how porous humanity actually is, how borders vanish under the patient pressure of time. The Mongol Empire produced catastrophe and commerce, tyranny and tolerance. Yet its most lasting artifact isn't a ruin. It's our shared genetic weave. In that sense, Genghis Khan's final conquest was unity itself, achieved unconsciously, even unwillingly, through the collisions of war. Standing today in the wind of Mongolia, one might feel that unity physically. The horizon runs unbroken in every direction. Sky and grass merge so seamlessly that distance blurs. It's easy to believe the steppe still remembers movement. The wind that once pushed millions of hooves now blows through streets of modern capitals where his descendants walk unaware. That same invisible force passes through boardrooms in London, through villages in China, through market stalls in Tehran, through classrooms in Chicago. It murmurs through blood, not banners. When we speak about the past, we forget that the past never leaves. It simply migrates into us. The empire's cruelty cannot be rewritten, but neither can its consequence be denied. The collapse of cities carved pathways for exchange far more durable than conquest. His generals' campaigns left the continents bruised, yet they also made the world contiguous for the first time since the Ice Age. Trade, language, disease, technology, all began to circulate in new patterns. The same horses that trampled temples also opened routes that would one day carry printing, gunpowder, and ideas of statehood into Europe. Every empire contributes both progress and trauma. Few, however, engrave them so literally into human DNA. The paradox defines our species. Violence divides. Fertility reunites. Looking at the distribution of the C2 lineage today feels like observing the slow redemption of destruction. What once manifested as slaughter and subjugation now registers as kinship. The materials of atrocity turn over centuries into the molecules of connection. The Mongol legacy, viewed through genetics, converts cruelty into cohesion, not morally but biologically. Evolution, after all, is pragmatic. It records existence, not ethics. Still, to humans capable of reflection, this adaptation offers lesson. History's ugliness may one day yield something resembling peace, if only because we learn to recognize ourselves in former enemies. To imagine that recognition requires humility. The temptation is to see Genghis Khan's story as exceptional, yet it is a mirror for all civilizations. Empires rise through force, merge through intimacy, and dissolve into their descendants. Rome, China, the Ottomans, the British, each extended their reach until power slipped from governments into genes. We are each of us mosaics of conquests forgotten. What distinguishes the Mongols is not pattern but scale, clarity, and the accident of discovery. We found their signature through science before we found moral language sufficient to interpret it. That scientific clarity changes everything. When archaeologists uncover ruins, people gaze with empathy for the vanished. When geneticists uncover ancestry, the vanished look back. Knowing that we carry fragments of both conqueror and conquered dismantles the illusion of purity. It forces a reckoning with shared origin. The genome reads like a prayer for equality disguised as measurement. No one is entirely victim, no one wholly victor. The very blood that bears empires also dissolves them. Time makes republics of us all. Somewhere within those 16 million lineages are countless contradictions. Sons who honored his name, men who never heard it, children born of love, others of violence, traders and monks, nomads and bureaucrats, teachers and thieves, each unknowingly carrying a portion of the Khan who once vowed to unite the world by force. He succeeded, but his method transformed in translation. The unity achieved through fear morphed into unity through inheritance. Biologists can show how that happens mathematically, but the poetry of it lies beyond calculation. His genome became a quiet language spoken without words, connecting strangers across continents more intimately than any treaty ever could. When you look at a world map at night, with cities glowing like embers, imagine those lights pulsing not in electricity, but in blood. Every spark a heartbeat, every heartbeat a memory. Inside those silent throbs beats an ancient rhythm, the biological echo of humanity's capacity to reshape itself. If power once moved outward from the Mongol tent, now it moves inward through revelation, the awareness that history lives inside, not behind, us. Even as we invent machines and medicines, we remain pilgrims of inheritance. In this realization hides the chapter's calm. Nothing in history, neither conquest nor civilization, ever truly disappears. It mutates into the living, carried unaware until rediscovered by curiosity. 16 million men may carry Genghis Khan's Y chromosome, but billions carry his lesson, that existence perpetuates itself despite morality, and that continuity itself is sacred, precisely because it outlasts judgment. Studying that continuity may actually redeem the chaos that produced it. We see that progress, like genetics, grows from improbable pairings, from the mingling of opposites forced into cooperation. The summation of his legacy resides not in Mongolia's museums, but in the collective human body. Every newborn draws first breath, using lungs refined through ancient hardships that his empire helped circulate. Every spoken word crosses linguistic bridges, strengthened by the roads his riders enforced. The Khan dreamed of uniting the world under one rule. 8 centuries later, his descendants accomplished that dream in quieter ways, through shared climate, shared culture, shared code. The future he sought by conquest now comes through connection. We inherit what he made, but we wield it differently. Every attempt to measure legacy eventually collapses into metaphor. What matters is not the number of descendants, but what that number forces us to see about the endurance of life. The empire Genghis Khan built existed for little more than a century in visible form, yet his biological empire endures uncounted. 16 million is only the segment scientists can trace. The rest of us carry echoes too subtle to name, traits inherited not through blood, but through consequence, ways of thinking shaped by the networks his conquests opened. History becomes less a ledger and more a circulatory system where every artery is a road, every cell a memory. From this perspective, the Khans and their subjects dissolve into single-species behavior, the instinct to expand, mingle, and survive. Whether by sword or spindle, by marriage or migration, we perpetually rewrite ourselves. The Mongols simply did it loudly enough for posterity to calculate. When modern people travel freely across borders their ancestors once died to defend, they enact the same motion that once defined the steppe, movement as existence. Civilization, it seems, has always been the domestication of migration. The moral distance between then and now tempts condemnation, Yet understanding softens judgment. Genghis Khan's wars extinguished millions, but also revealed the biological democracy hidden inside human cruelty. That no family, given time, remains isolated, that even empire makers eventually merge with the conquered until only sameness prevails. In our shared genome, victors and victims clasp hands. That realization diminishes no suffering. It simply completes the equation. Philosophers identify in this story a mirror of mortality itself. Every person wages a small war against forgetting, hoping to leave something that continues. Child, idea, kindness, or code. Most attempts vanish, a few endure. Genghis Khan's legacy is extreme only in scale. What one man pursued through conquest, our species pursues through creation. Life, indifferent to intention, rewards both methods equally because both keep the pulse going. When scientists sequence that pulse, they are reading not the conqueror's triumph, but evolution's syntax. Survival spoken consecutively across all eras. So, when we say his DNA lives, what we mean is that existence uses every tool, noble or brutal, to continue. The lesson is humbling. It reframes greatness as participation, not domination. The same molecule linking his sons to modern strangers reminds us that the empire of life values continuity over fame. Against that endless chain, politics, morality, even architecture appear temporary experiments. One day, laboratories mapping human diversity will finish their references and reach precision beyond current imagining. By then, the statistics will no longer shock. 16 million descendants will be ordinary, folded into an even wider understanding that all ancestry merges eventually, that identity and otherness are momentary illusions. We will realize that we are all custodians of countless forgotten empires humming within us. The film closes not on war horses, but on silence. Wind moves across open grass. Cameras rise into night. The narration lowers to a whisper. Empires fall, languages die, memories fade, but the body remembers. In every heartbeat of 16 million men, the step still rides.